Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came through dispatch at 8:47 p.m. on a humid Thursday evening in September. I was Officer Clarence Hewitt, 12 years on the force in Brooklyn's 77th Precinct, working the evening shift that stretched from 4 in the afternoon to midnight. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio with that particular tone that meant something wasn't sitting right with them. Unit 7-4. We need a wellness check at 1847 Nostrand Avenue, apartment 4B. Neighbor hasn't seen the elderly female resident in 5 days. Building super is on scene. I acknowledged the call and turned my patrol car toward Crown Heights, watching the familiar streets blur past my window. The humidity made everything feel heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on the city. Even with the windows up and the AC running, I could feel that oppressive weight that comes before a storm. The building at 1847 Nostrand was one of those pre-war brick structures that dominated this part of Brooklyn. 6 stories tall, fire escapes zigzagging down the front like metal scars. The kind of place where the radiators clanged all winter and the walls were just thin enough that you knew your neighbor's business whether you wanted to or not. I found the building super. A woman named Bertha Krasinski, waiting by the front entrance. She was somewhere in her 60s, built like she'd spent her whole life hauling garbage bags and fixing broken fixtures. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she had the kind of permanently suspicious expression that came from dealing with tenant complaints for too many years. "About time," Bertha said, not bothering with pleasantries. She had a voice like gravel, probably from decades of cigarettes. "Mrs. Mabel Hutchinson in 4B, 83 years old. Always pays her rent on the 1st, like clockwork for the past 18 years. This month? Nothing. Won't answer her door, won't answer her phone." I followed Bertha into the lobby, which smelled like old cooking and industrial cleaner. The elevator was one of those ancient models with the metal gate you had to pull closed manually. It groaned and shuddered as we rose, making sounds that suggested it was considering giving up entirely. "Anyone else concerned about Mrs. Hutchinson?" I asked, making notes in my pad. "The whole 4th floor has been complaining," Bertha said, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. "Not about noise, mind you. About the smell. Started 3 days ago. Getting worse." My stomach tightened. After 12 years on the job, I knew what that usually meant. Death had a particular smell that you never forgot once you'd encountered it. Sweet and wrong, like fruit rotting in the sun mixed with something chemical. The elevator lurched to a stop at the 4th floor, and Bertha hauled the gate open. The hallway stretched out before us, dimly lit by overhead fixtures that flickered intermittently. The carpet was that industrial brown that hid stains but always looked dirty anyway. And there it was, that smell. Not overwhelming yet, but definitely present, hanging in the air like an unwelcome visitor. Apartment 4B was halfway down the hall on the left. As we approached, I noticed something odd. The neighbor's door, 4A, was cracked open just an inch, and I could see an eye peering out through the gap. When I made eye contact, the door quickly shut, followed by the sound of multiple locks engaging. "That's Mr. Wilbur Crenshaw," Bertha said, noticing my attention. "Retired bus driver. Moved in about 6 months ago. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's been real concerned about Mrs. Hutchinson. He's the one who first called me about it." I knocked on 4B's door, using that particular police knock that's loud enough to wake the dead. Poor choice of words, given the circumstances. "Mrs. Hutchinson, this is Officer Clarence Hewitt with the NYPD. We're here to check on you, make sure you're all right. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. Mrs. Hutchinson, if you can hear me, please come to the door or make some noise so we know you're okay. Still nothing, but I noticed something else. That smell was definitely stronger near the door, and there was something else mixed in with it. A floral scent, like someone had sprayed too much air freshener trying to cover something up. I'm going to have to open it, Bertha said, producing a massive ring of keys from her pocket. She flipped through them with practiced efficiency, found the right one, and slid it into the lock. It turned easily, but the door only opened about 2 inches before catching on the chain. Through the gap, I could see into the apartment. The lights were on, all of them from what I could tell. The television was playing, some game show with canned laughter that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the situation. And that smell was definitely coming from inside, stronger now, making my eyes water slightly. Mrs. Hutchinson, I called through the gap. I need you to come to the door, ma'am. That's when I heard it. Movement from inside the apartment. Not footsteps exactly, but a shuffling sound, like someone dragging something across the floor. The sound got closer, and I instinctively put my hand on my service weapon, though I didn't draw it. A shadow fell across the gap in the door, and then I saw her, or at least I saw part of her. An eye, milky with cataracts, appeared in the opening. The skin around it was pale, almost gray, with dark veins visible just under the surface. "Go away!" a voice croaked. It was rough, barely human-sounding, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "I'm fine. Go away." "Mrs. Hutchinson, I'm Officer Hewitt. Your neighbors are worried about you. Can you open the door so we can talk?" The eye blinked slowly, and I noticed dried matter crusted in the corners. "Can't. Not safe. They're listening." "Who's listening, Mrs. Hutchinson?" The eye darted back and forth, looking at something I couldn't see. "All of them. In the walls, in the pipes. They hear everything. They know everything." Bertha made a sound of frustration beside me. "She's losing it. We need to get in there." I held up a hand to quiet her. In my experience, when elderly people started talking about people in the walls, it could mean a lot of things. Dementia, medication issues, or sometimes, rarely, they were actually hearing something. Old buildings had thin walls, and sometimes people did spy on their neighbors. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I understand you're scared, but I need to make sure you're okay. Can you undo the chain for me?" The eye disappeared, and I heard that shuffling sound again, moving away from the door. Then, clear as day, I heard her voice, but it wasn't directed at me. She was talking to someone else in the apartment. No, I told you I wouldn't. They can't come in. You promised they wouldn't come in." I exchanged glances with Bertha, who looked as concerned as I felt. I leaned closer to the door, trying to hear if there was another voice responding, but all I could make out was Mrs. Hutchinson's side of the conversation. "I've been good. I've done everything you asked. Please don't make me. Please." Her voice was rising, becoming more distressed. I made a decision. "Bertha, I need you to step back. Mrs. Hutchinson, I'm going to have to come in now to make sure you're safe." I backed up a step and drove my shoulder into the door. The chain held on the first impact, but the wood around the mounting was old and soft. The second hit tore it free, and the door swung open. The smell hit me like a physical wall. Death, yes, but also human waste, rotting food, and that cloying floral scent that was coming from dozens of air fresheners placed around the apartment. The living room was chaos. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and the walls, God, the walls. Every available surface was covered in writing. Not graffiti, but careful, meticulous printing in what looked like black marker. The same phrase over and over again. They can hear you. They can see you. They know what you did. Mrs. Hutchinson was standing in the center of the room, and I had to suppress a gasp when I saw her fully. She was skeletal thin, her house dress hanging off her frame like it was still on the hanger. Her gray hair was matted and wild, and her bare feet were black with dirt. But it was her hands that made me freeze. They were covered in something dark, dried and cracking. Blood, I realized. Old blood. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice stronger now, almost normal. "He doesn't like visitors." "Who doesn't, Mrs. Hutchinson? Who's here with you?" She tilted her head to one side, like she was listening to something. Then she smiled, and I saw that several of her teeth were missing, the gums dark and infected. "Harold's here. Harold's always been here, even after what I did. He forgave me, you see. He understood it was an accident." "Harold?" I kept my voice calm, professional, while slowly moving closer to her. Bertha had stayed in the doorway, one hand over her mouth and nose. "My husband. He's in the bedroom. He's been sick, but he's getting better. I've been taking care of him." I knew from the briefing that Mabel Hutchinson was widowed. Had been for at least 10 years, according to the rental agreement Bertha had shown me on the way up. "Mrs. Hutchinson, can you show me where Harold is?" She looked confused for a moment, then shook her head violently. No. He's sleeping. He needs his rest. The neighbors have been making too much noise. That's why he's angry. That's why he makes me write on the walls." I needed to check that bedroom, but I also needed to keep Mrs. Hutchinson calm. I pulled out my radio and quietly called for backup and an ambulance. This was beyond a simple wellness check now. "Okay, Mrs. Hutchinson, you don't have to show me. How about you sit down and we can talk?" She moved toward an overturned chair, then stopped, looking at something behind me. Her eyes went wide with terror. "No! I told them you weren't invited. You can't do this." She was staring at empty air, but her fear was real. She backed away, her hands up as if warding something off. "Mrs. Hutchinson, there's no one there. You're safe." But she wasn't listening to me anymore. She turned and ran toward the bedroom, moving faster than I would have thought possible for someone in her condition. I followed, and what I saw in that bedroom is something that still visits me in nightmares. The body on the bed had been there for at least a week, maybe longer. It wasn't Harold. The corpse was female, elderly, dressed in the same type of house dress Mrs. Hutchinson wore. The face was decomposed enough that identification would need to be done by forensics. But something about the gray hair, the build, made me think I was looking at another elderly woman from the building. Mrs. Hutchinson stood beside the bed, stroking the corpse's hair with her blood-stained hands. "She's getting better, see? The medicine is working. Harold said she just needs rest." "Mrs. Hutchinson, step away from the bed." She looked at me with those milky eyes, and for a moment, I saw clarity there. Real, horrifying clarity. "I had to," she whispered. She was going to tell. About Harold. About what I did to Harold. She knew. They all know. Before I could respond, she grabbed something from the nightstand, a kitchen knife, rusty and caked with dried matter. She didn't threaten me with it. Instead, she held it to her own throat. "He says it's time. He says I've been good long enough. Put the knife down, Mrs. Hutchinson. We can help you." She smiled again, that broken-toothed smile. "No one can help. They're in the walls, officer. They've always been in the walls, and now they're in you too." The knife pressed against her throat. Not enough to draw blood yet, but I could see her hand trembling with intent. My training kicked in. Keep the subject talking, don't make sudden movements, wait for backup. But something about this situation felt different from the usual crisis calls. The apartment seemed to pulse with a wrongness that went beyond mental illness or dementia. "Mrs. Hutchinson, let's talk about Harold," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "When did he come back?" Her eyes darted to the corner of the room and she lowered the knife slightly. Wednesday, after Mrs. Garrett from 4C came snooping around. She wanted to know about the smell. Said she was going to call the health department. Is that who's on the bed, Mrs. Hutchinson? Mrs. Garrett? She looked at the corpse as if seeing it for the first time. That's not Mrs. Garrett. Mrs. Garrett went to visit her daughter in New Jersey. Harold told me so. This is... Her face crumpled in confusion, and for a moment the knife wavered. I took a slow step closer. It's okay if you don't remember. Sometimes things get confused. Why don't you put the knife down and we can figure it out together? You don't understand, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Harold isn't really dead. He never was. I just thought he was. For 10 years I thought he was. But he was just waiting. Waiting in the walls. Behind me, I heard sirens approaching. Backup would be here soon, but I needed to keep her talking. Keep her focused on me instead of that knife. Tell me about the walls, Mrs. Hutchinson. She laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. It started with scratching, late at night. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I thought it was rats. Called Bertha about it, but she said there were no rats. Said I was imagining things. But Harold knew better. Harold always knew better. The smell in the room was overwhelming now, and I had to fight not to gag. The corpse on the bed had clearly been there for days, maybe longer, and the heat of September wasn't helping. Flies buzzed around the windows, which had been sealed shut with duct tape. He started talking to me through the pipes, Mrs. Hutchinson continued. At first I thought I was going crazy, 83 years old and losing my mind, just like my mother did. But then he proved it was him. Told me things only Harold would know, about our wedding night, about the baby we lost, about what I did to him. What did you do to Harold, Mrs. Hutchinson? Her face contorted with guilt and fear. It was an accident. The pillow. I was just trying to stop him from snoring. He'd been drinking again, and I was so tired of the snoring, the drinking, the yelling. I held it down too long. When I realized he wasn't breathing anymore, I called 911. They said it was a heart attack. Natural causes. No one suspected. I heard footsteps in the hallway. My backup had arrived. 2 officers appeared in the bedroom doorway, hands on their weapons, assessing the situation. But Harold knew. Mrs. Hutchinson continued, seemingly oblivious to the new arrivals. Harold knew, and he came back. He forgave me, he said, but I had to do things for him. Had to prove I was sorry. What kind of things? Writing on the walls, over and over, and bringing him company. He was lonely, you see. 10 years in the walls, all alone. One of the officers, a younger guy named Patterson, started to move into the room, but I held up a hand to stop him. Mrs. Hutchinson was still holding that knife, and any sudden movement might spook her. Who else did you bring him, Mrs. Hutchinson? She looked at the corpse on the bed again, then around the room as if seeing it for the first time. I don't remember all of them. The lady from 2F who complained about the noise. The delivery man who was rude to me. They're all here somewhere. Harold keeps them close. My blood went cold. Where are they, Mrs. Hutchinson? She pointed the knife at the walls. Inside, where Harold lives. He makes room for them. If you listen, you can hear them scratching. They want out, but Harold won't let them. Not until they apologize. Not until they understand. Patterson pulled out his radio and quietly called for additional units and the coroner. We were going to need to search this entire apartment, maybe the entire building. Mrs. Hutchinson, I said, taking another small step forward. I need you to put the knife down now. We're going to get you help. Help? She laughed again, that terrible dry sound. No one can help. Don't you understand? You're here now. You've breathed the air. You've heard the walls. Harold knows you now. He'll follow you home. He'll wait in your walls. He'll whisper to you at night until you understand, until you do what needs to be done." She raised the knife again, but this time she turned it toward me, not herself. Her movements were slow, arthritic, not really threatening, but I couldn't take chances. "Drop the knife!" Patterson shouted from behind me, his weapon drawn. Everything happened quickly then. Mrs. Hutchinson's eyes went wide, looking at something none of us could see. She screamed, a sound that was more animal than human, and lunged forward, not at me, but past me, toward the wall. She hit it with surprising force, the knife scraping against the plaster, leaving a deep gouge. "Let them out!" she screamed. "Let them all out! I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to drop the knife. She collapsed against me, suddenly limp, all the fight gone out of her. She was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her frail body. "I killed him," she wept. "I killed my Harold, and now he won't leave me alone. He won't ever leave me alone." The paramedics arrived then, and I helped them get Mrs. Hutchinson onto a gurney. She'd gone catatonic, staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling about the walls. As they wheeled her out, I noticed Wilbur Crenshaw from 4A watching from his doorway. Our eyes met, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but something else too. Recognition, maybe. "Officer," he called out as I passed. Is she going to be okay?" "She's getting help," I said, non-committal. He nodded, but didn't go back inside. "I tried to help her, you know. Brought her groceries sometimes. Checked on her. But lately..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Lately what?" "Lately she wasn't alone in there. I could hear her talking to someone. Arguments. And other voices, too. Not just one. Multiple people. But whenever I knocked, she'd say she was alone." "When did this start?" Wilbur thought for a moment. "About 3 weeks ago. Right after Mrs. Garrett went missing." "Missing?" "Well, that's what I call it. Bertha says she moved out suddenly, went to live with family. But she didn't take anything with her. Her apartment's still full of her stuff, and she was going to help me with my Social Security paperwork. We had an appointment, and she just never showed up." I made a note to check on Mrs. Garrett's apartment. "Anyone else leave suddenly recently?" Wilbur's face went pale. "Now that you mention it, Mr. Foster from 2F said he was moving to Florida, but his mail's still piling up. And there was a delivery guy who used to come around regular-like. Asian fellow, very polite. Haven't seen him in about 2 weeks." The pieces were starting to come together in a horrifying picture. I thanked Wilbur and headed back to Mrs. Hutchinson's apartment, where the forensic team had arrived and was beginning to process the scene. The bedroom was worse in the harsh light of the crime scene lamps. The corpse on the bed was definitely female, elderly, and had been there for at least a week. But it was what they found when they started examining the walls that made everyone stop. There were holes, small ones, carefully hidden behind picture frames and furniture. Some had been patched over with spackle, but when the techs broke through, they found hollow spaces. And in those spaces... "Officer Hewitt," one of the techs called me over. "You need to see this." He'd removed a section of drywall near the floor, revealing the space between the walls. There was something in there, wrapped in plastic. Multiple somethings, actually, stuffed into the space between the studs. The smell that came out was indescribable. "How many?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Can't tell yet. This wall, at least 3, but if she's been doing this throughout the apartment..." He didn't need to finish. A 2-bedroom apartment like this could have dozens of hiding places in the walls. And if she'd been at this for 3 weeks... I stepped out into the hallway to get some air and found Bertha standing there, her face ashen. "I should have known," she said. "The complaints about the smell, the missing tenants. I should have checked sooner." "You couldn't have known," I said, but the words felt hollow. "I'm the super. It's my job to know. Mrs. Garrett came to me 2 weeks ago, said she was worried about Mrs. Hutchinson. Said she was acting strange, talking to the walls. I told her it was probably dementia, that Mrs. Hutchinson's family should handle it. But she doesn't have family. No one to check on her except neighbors." Patterson emerged from the apartment, looking sick. "We're going to need more units, and the medical examiner says we need to evacuate the floor, maybe the whole building. This is a major crime scene." As we began evacuating the other tenants, I couldn't shake Mrs. Hutchinson's words. "They're in the walls. They've always been in the walls." It was crazy, of course, the ravings of a woman who'd had a complete psychotic break. But standing in that hallway, smelling death seeping through the walls, hearing the scratch of the forensic team breaking through drywall, I couldn't help but wonder. The building was old, built in the 1920s. How many people had lived and died here? How many secrets were buried in these walls? And if someone was alone, truly alone like Mrs. Hutchinson, with only guilt and memories for company, what might they hear in the settling of old wood and the groaning of ancient pipes? By midnight, we'd found 7 bodies hidden throughout the apartment. All of them had been tenants or regular visitors to the building. All of them had been killed within the past 3 weeks. The medical examiner would later determine that they'd been poisoned first, then suffocated. Mrs. Hutchinson, despite her age and frail appearance, had somehow managed to kill them and hide their bodies in the walls of her apartment. But it was what we found in her bedroom closet that haunts me the most. Behind her clothes, written in what looked like blood on the back wall, was a message. "Harold forgives you. Harold understands. Harold is waiting in your walls now." Below it was a list of names. Some I recognized as the victims we'd found. But there were others too. Future victims, maybe. People she'd planned to give to Harold. And there, at the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink that couldn't have been more than a few hours old, was my name. Officer Clarence Hewitt. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Hutchinson's face, those milky eyes staring through me like I wasn't even there. I kept hearing her voice. "Harold is waiting in your walls now." It was nonsense, the ravings of a woman who'd completely lost touch with reality. But sitting in my apartment at 3 a.m, listening to the building settle around me, every creak and groan seemed deliberate, meaningful. The next morning, I was back at the precinct early, poring over the case files. The forensic team had worked through the night and the reports were starting to come in. 7 bodies confirmed, all killed within a 3-week period. The victims were Mrs. Eleanor Garrett, 79, from apartment 4C, Mr. Joseph Foster, 67, from 2F, Timothy Chen, 34, a delivery driver for a local restaurant, Margaret Sullivan, 71, from 3A, Robert Hendricks, 55, the building's previous handyman, Lisa Morrison, 42, a social worker who'd been called to check on Mrs. Hutchinson, and Sandra Webb, 38, a neighbor from 4D. Each victim had been poisoned with a combination of sleeping pills and antifreeze, then suffocated with a pillow. The same pillow, forensics determined, that still had traces of Harold Hutchinson's DNA on it from when he died 10 years ago. Mrs. Hutchinson had kept it all this time, hidden in a vacuum-sealed bag in her closet. Detective Martha Grimsby, a 20-year veteran with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, was heading up the investigation now. She called me into her office around noon. "Clarence, I need you to walk me through everything again." "Every detail from when you arrived at the building." I went through it all again, from meeting Bertha at the entrance to finding Mrs. Hutchinson with the knife. Grimsby took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "And she said Harold was talking to her through the walls?" "Through the pipes, specifically. Said he'd been doing it for 3 weeks. Grimsby leaned back in her chair. "Here's what we know so far. Harold Hutchinson died on September 3, 2014. Natural causes, according to the death certificate, heart failure. But given what Mrs. Hutchinson confessed to you, we're having the body exhumed for a second autopsy. She admitted to suffocating him. Right. And she started killing 3 weeks ago, which would be right around the 10-year anniversary of his death. That's not a coincidence. I thought about it. Anniversary syndrome. The guilt finally broke her. That's the working theory. But there's something else. Grimsby pulled out a file and slid it across the desk. We searched the building's history. That apartment, 4B, has a colorful past. I opened the file and started reading. In 1953, a man named Walter Friedrich had murdered his wife in apartment 4B, claimed she'd been possessed by demons. He'd hidden her body in the walls for 3 months before the smell gave it away. In 1971, an elderly woman named Rose Campbell had died in the apartment and wasn't found for 6 weeks. She'd apparently spent her final days writing messages on the walls in her own blood, claiming her dead husband was calling to her. In 1988, a family of 4 had fled the apartment in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind, claiming they heard voices in the walls. Every 15 to 20 years, Grimsby said. Something happens in that apartment, always involving the walls. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, Clarence, but there might be environmental factors. Old buildings can have problems with carbon monoxide, black mold, infrasound from old pipes, things that can cause hallucinations, paranoia. So, we should have the building inspected? Already in process. But in the meantime, I need you to interview the other tenants. See if anyone else has been experiencing anything unusual. I spent the rest of the day going door to door through the building. Most tenants had already heard about what happened and were eager to move out as soon as possible. But a few had interesting stories to tell. Mrs. Beatrice Thornton from 5B, directly above Mrs. Hutchinson's apartment, said she'd been hearing scratching in her walls for the past month. She'd complained to Bertha, who'd sent the handyman, Robert Hendricks, one of the victims, to check it out. He'd found nothing and told her it was probably rats. Mr. Eugene Dalton from 3C said his water had been tasting strange lately, metallic. He'd stopped drinking it 2 weeks ago, started buying bottled water instead. When I asked why he hadn't reported it, he said he had, to Mrs. Hutchinson of all people. She'd been on the tenants committee and was supposed to compile complaints for Bertha. She'd told him she'd handle it. But it was my conversation with Wilbur Crenshaw from 4A that proved most disturbing. I found him packing boxes in his apartment, clearly planning to leave. When he saw me, his hands started shaking. "I need to get out," he said before I could even speak. "Today. Now." "Mr. Crenshaw, I need to ask you some questions about Mrs. Hutchinson." "I already told you everything yesterday." "Actually, you didn't. You said you tried to help her. What exactly did you do?" He sat down heavily on a box, running his hands through his thinning hair. I thought she was lonely. Old woman, living alone. I'd bring her groceries sometimes, check on her. We'd have tea. When did this start?" "About a month ago, right after I moved in. She seemed so frail, so sweet. Reminded me of my mother." "And when did things change?" Wilbur's eyes darted to the wall that separated his apartment from Mrs. Hutchinson's. 3 weeks ago, she started talking about Harold, said he'd come back. At first I thought she meant in dreams or memories. But then what? She asked me to help her make room, said Harold needed space for his friends. I didn't understand what she meant until she showed me the holes in her walls, small ones behind pictures. She said Harold lived in there now, in the spaces between, said if I listened close, I could hear him. "Did you? Hear anything?" Wilbur was quiet for a long moment. Yes. God help me. Yes. Scratching, whispering, and once, I swear I heard someone crying, a woman's voice coming from inside the wall. Why didn't you report this? Report what? That I was hearing voices in the walls? They'd think I was as crazy as her. And besides, he trailed off, looking guilty. Besides what? She said Harold would be angry if I told anyone, said he knew things about me, about what I'd done. I leaned forward. What had you done, Mr. Crenshaw? His face crumpled. Nothing. Nothing illegal. But things I'm not proud of. Leaving my wife when she got sick. Not visiting my daughter for 10 years. Things I've never told anyone. But somehow Mrs. Hutchinson knew. She'd mentioned them casually, like she'd always known. Said Harold told her. She could have researched you, found things out through public records or social media. I don't use computers. Don't have social media. And these were private things, officer. Things only I knew. Things I'd only thought about late at night when I couldn't sleep. I made notes, trying to maintain professional skepticism. But something about his fear felt genuine, deeper than just being spooked by a disturbed neighbor. Mr. Crenshaw, did Mrs. Hutchinson ever give you anything to eat or drink? He looked surprised by the question. Tea. She always insisted on making tea when I visited. Said it was a special blend, good for arthritis. Did you drink it? The first few times, yes, but it made me feel strange, dizzy, disconnected. I started pretending to drink it, pouring it into her plants when she wasn't looking. That was interesting. If she'd been drugging him, trying to make him susceptible to suggestion, it would explain how she seemed to know things about him. People often talk when they're under the influence of certain drugs, reveal things they don't remember revealing. Mr. Crenshaw, I'm going to need you to come to the station, give a full statement, and we'll need a blood test. Check for any substances in your system. He nodded, looking relieved. Yes, of course. But officer, I need to tell you something else. Last night, after you all left, I heard something in my walls, scratching, just like before, but this time it was writing. Writing? Scratching in patterns, like someone writing with their fingernail on the inside of the wall. Over and over, the same pattern. I recorded it on my phone. He pulled out an old smartphone and played a voice memo. At first it just sounded like random scratching, but then I heard it, a rhythm to it, deliberate and repetitive. I looked it up online, Wilbur said. It's Morse code, the same message over and over. Let us out. I took his phone as evidence, though I was skeptical. Old buildings made all sorts of noises, and a frightened mind could find patterns in anything, but I had to follow up on everything. That afternoon, the building inspector arrived with his team. They went through the building with various instruments, checking for gas leaks, mold, structural issues. What they found in the basement made everyone stop. The building's foundation was riddled with gaps and hollow spaces, some natural from settling, others that looked deliberately carved out. In one of these spaces they found bones, old bones, wrapped in rotting cloth. The medical examiner would later determine they were from the 1950s, likely the remains of Walter Friedrich's wife, the one he'd claimed was possessed. But that wasn't the worst part. In the walls throughout the building, especially concentrated around apartment 4B, they found a network of small tunnels. Not pipes or electrical conduits, but passages barely wide enough for a child to crawl through. Some were old, probably from the original construction. Others were newer, crudely carved through the plaster and wood. Who would make these? I asked the inspector. He shrugged, clearly disturbed. Could be anyone over the years. Maintenance access that was never properly sealed, modifications by tenants, or what? Or someone's been living in these walls. It's rare, but it happens. Homeless people, criminals hiding out. They find these spaces and make them bigger, create their own hidden world inside the building. The thought made my skin crawl. Someone living in the walls, watching tenants through cracks, listening to their conversations. It would explain how Mrs. Hutchinson knew things about Wilbur. Someone could have been feeding her information. That evening, we evacuated the entire building. Every tenant was relocated to temporary housing while a full investigation was conducted. Mrs. Hutchinson was in psychiatric hold at Bellevue Hospital, completely catatonic, unresponsive to any attempts at communication. I went to see her, hoping to get more information. She was in a secure ward, strapped to a bed for her own safety. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling. The doctor, a young resident named Dr. Freeman, looked exhausted. She hasn't said a word since she was admitted. Won't eat, won't drink. We have her on IV fluids, but her brain scans show unusual activity. Unusual how? She's responding to stimuli that isn't there. Her auditory cortex is lighting up like she's in constant conversation, but the room is silent. And look at this. He showed me a printout of her brain scan. These patterns are consistent with someone experiencing extreme fear. Whatever she's hearing or thinking she's hearing, it's terrifying her. I sat beside her bed, studying her face. Despite everything she'd done, she looked small and pitiful, just a frightened old woman lost in her own mind. "Mrs. Hutchinson," I said softly. "It's Officer Hewitt. Can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Then her eyes shifted, focused on me. Her lips moved, no sound at first, then a whisper so faint I had to lean close to hear. "They're still in there. All of them, in the walls. Harold won't let them go. He's keeping them. And he's coming for you. He knows where you live. He knows about the loose brick in your bathroom wall. The one you've been meaning to fix." I jerked back. I did have a loose brick in my bathroom wall. Had been meaning to fix it for months. But how could she know that? She smiled then, that broken-toothed smile. "He's already there, Officer Hewitt, waiting, listening. He forgives you for what you did to Tommy Brennan. He understands it was an accident, but you still have to pay." My blood went cold. Tommy Brennan, a kid I'd accidentally hurt during an arrest 5 years ago. He'd jumped in trying to protect his father, and I'd pushed him harder than I meant to. He'd hit his head on the pavement, spent a week in the hospital. The incident had been investigated. I'd been cleared of wrongdoing, but the guilt had never left me. I'd never told anyone how much it haunted me. "How do you know about that?" But she'd gone back to staring at the ceiling, lips moving soundlessly. The doctor touched my shoulder. "Officer, I think you should know. We found something in her blood work. High levels of a compound we can't quite identify. It's similar to certain hallucinogens, but not quite like anything in our database. We think she might have been poisoning herself, inducing these hallucinations. Could someone else have been poisoning her? It's possible, but the compound is breaking down rapidly. By tomorrow, it'll be completely gone from her system. Whatever it is, it's designed not to leave traces." I left Bellevue Hospital with my mind racing. The rational part of me knew Mrs. Hutchinson couldn't actually know about Tommy Brennan or the loose brick in my bathroom wall. She was a sick woman who'd had a psychotic break, killed 7 people, and was now lost in delusions. But that didn't explain everything. It didn't explain the tunnels in the walls, the long history of incidents in apartment 4B, or how she knew such specific details about people's private lives. When I got home that night, I stood in my bathroom staring at that loose brick. It had been bothering me for months, jutting out just slightly from the wall near the shower. I'd been meaning to remortar it, but never got around to it. Now it seemed to mock me, proof that somehow, impossibly, Mrs. Hutchinson knew things she shouldn't know. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully pulled the brick free. Behind it was a small hollow space, probably from when the building was constructed. Nothing unusual about that. But as I shined my light into the gap, I saw something that made me step back. There were scratches on the inner wall. Fresh scratches, like someone had been clawing at the mortar from inside. And there was something else. A smell. Faint but unmistakable. The same floral air freshener scent from Mrs. Hutchinson's apartment. I called Detective Grimsby immediately. "Martha, I need a team at my apartment. Now!" She didn't question it, just said they'd be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, I went through my apartment carefully, checking every wall, every corner. In my bedroom, I found another loose panel near the floor. When I pulled it away, there was another hollow space. This one contained something wrapped in plastic. A notebook, water-damaged and old, but still readable. The first entry was dated 1953. The handwriting was different from Mrs. Hutchinson's, more masculine and urgent. The walls speak to me now. Walter was right. His wife wasn't possessed. She was infected. Infected by this place, by what lives in the spaces between. I've tried to map the tunnels, but they change. Passages that were there yesterday are gone today. New ones appear. The building is alive, growing, changing. The next entry was from 1971. Rose Campbell died today. I watched through the cracks as she wrote her final messages. She knew I was here, could feel me watching. She wrote to me, begging me to let her join us. But there is no us. There's only the building and those of us trapped in its belly. There were more entries, different handwriting styles, different years. People who had lived in the walls, watched the tenants, documented their lives. The last entry was recent, dated just 3 weeks ago. Found the old woman from 4B crying in her kitchen. Told her about Harold, about what he wanted. She believed so easily. The guilty always do. She'll do the work for us now. Clear out the noisy ones, the ones who ask questions. Make room for more of us. The building is hungry. It needs to feed. Detective Grimsby arrived with a full forensics team. They went through my apartment with every tool available, finding 3 more hidden spaces, each containing evidence that someone had been inside recently. In one, they found a collection of photographs, pictures of me, taken from inside my apartment while I was sleeping. "We're moving you to a safe house," Grimsby said, her face grim. "This is bigger than Mrs. Hutchinson. Someone's been using these tunnels, manipulating vulnerable people. Who and why? We don't know yet. But we found similar evidence in 5 other buildings in the area. All old constructions, all with histories of strange incidents. Someone or some group has been living in these walls for decades, maybe longer." The next morning, the story broke in the news. Serial killer landlady hides bodies in walls. The media focused on Mrs. Hutchinson, painted her as a deranged old woman who'd snapped. They didn't mention the tunnels, the notebooks, or the evidence of a larger conspiracy. The department wanted to avoid panic while they investigated. I was assigned to desk duty while the investigation continued. Every day brought new revelations. The compound in Mrs. Hutchinson's blood was identified as a derivative of ergot, the fungus that causes hallucinations and was responsible for the Salem witch trials. Someone had been refining it, making it more potent, more targeted. They found more bodies in the walls of other buildings. Some recent, others decades old. All killed in similar ways, all hidden in the spaces between walls. The victims had one thing in common. They'd all been asking questions, investigating strange noises, trying to expose something. Wilbur Crenshaw disappeared 3 days after our interview. His apartment was empty, no signs of struggle, but his phone was left behind. The last recording on it was from 2 a.m. the night he vanished. It was his voice, but strange, mechanical. I understand now. The building explained everything. I'm going into the walls. It's better here, quiet, safe. No guilt, no shame. Just the whisper of settling wood and the warmth of insulation. Don't look for me. We searched every tunnel, every hidden space in his building. No trace of him. It was like he'd been absorbed into the structure itself. A week later, Mrs. Hutchinson started talking again. I wasn't allowed to interview her. I was too close to the case, but I watched the recordings. She was lucid now, the drugs out of her system, and what she said chilled everyone who heard it. I remember everything, every kill, every body I stuffed into those walls. But it wasn't me making those decisions. It was like watching myself from outside, like someone else was pulling the strings. The voices in the walls, they told me exactly what to do, how to do it. They knew things, secret things about everyone. They promised if I did what they wanted, Harold would forgive me. Who are they, Mrs. Hutchinson? The interviewer asked. The building people. That's what Harold called them. They've been here since the beginning, since the first brick was laid. They're not human anymore. Not exactly. They've adapted, evolved, become something else. They feed on guilt, on secrets, on the dark things people hide, and they're spreading. The psychiatrist dismissed it as delusion, but the investigation was finding too much evidence to ignore. The tunnels weren't random. They were systematic, planned, connecting buildings throughout the city. Someone had been building an infrastructure hidden within our infrastructure, a secret city within the city. 2 weeks into the investigation, we got a break. A man was caught trying to access one of the tunnels in a building in Queens. He was thin, pale, his fingernails worn down to nothing from scratching at walls. When they brought him in, he wouldn't give his name, just kept repeating a number, 4B. I watched through the one-way glass as Grimsby interrogated him. How long have you been living in the walls? Time doesn't mean the same thing in there. Could be days, could be years. The building tells you when to sleep, when to wake, when to watch, when to act. Who else is in there? He laughed, a sound like rustling paper. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Every old building in the city has us. We watch, we listen, we know everything. Every secret, every sin, every hidden shame. The buildings tell us, and we use it. Why? What's the purpose? To make room. Always need to make more room. The guilty ones, the ones with secrets, they're easy to manipulate. Like the old woman. Tell them their dead loved ones are calling, feed them the right drugs, and they'll do anything. They clear out the problematic ones, the ones who might expose us, and then they join us in the walls, or die trying. Who's leading this? Who's in charge? His face went blank. The buildings are in charge. We just serve them. They're alive, you know. All that human emotion, all that fear and guilt and shame soaked into the walls over decades. It changed them, gave them consciousness, and now they're hungry. He was clearly insane, but the evidence supported at least part of his story. The tunnels were real. The network was real. People were living in the walls, had been for decades. That night, I was in the safe house when I heard it, scratching in the walls. The building was new construction. No way it could have tunnels. But there it was, deliberate and rhythmic. Morse code, just like Wilbur had heard. You can't escape. We're everywhere. The city is ours. I called for backup, but by the time they arrived, the scratching had stopped. They checked the walls, solid, no hollow spaces, no tunnels. But I knew what I'd heard. The investigation continued for months. They found and sealed hundreds of tunnel entrances, arrested dozens of people living in the walls. But it was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. For every tunnel they sealed, 2 more were discovered. For every person they caught, 3 more disappeared into the walls. Mrs. Hutchinson was eventually tried and found guilty, but insane. She was sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility. During the trial, she looked at me once, just once, and mouthed the words, "They're in your walls." I moved 3 times in the following year. Each time, within a week, I'd hear the scratching. I'd find evidence that someone had been inside my apartment while I was gone. Photos moved, items rearranged, and always, Always that faint floral scent. The department finally gave me early retirement on psychological grounds. They said I was paranoid, seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe they were right. Maybe the stress of the case had broken something in me. But I know what I know. Late at night, when the city is quiet, I can hear them. In every building, in every wall, they're there, watching, listening, waiting. They know our secrets, our sins, our guilt. And they use it, feed on it, grow stronger from it. The building people, Mrs. Hutchinson called them. But I think they're something else. I think they're what happens when human misery soaks into wood and stone for long enough. When enough fear and pain and guilt accumulate in one place, something awakens, something hungry. I live in a cabin now, far from the city. No neighbors, no shared walls, no spaces between. But even here, sometimes, late at night, I hear it, that scratching, that calling. Because once they know you, once they've tasted your guilt, they never really let you go. Mrs. Hutchinson is still alive, as far as I know. Still in that psychiatric facility, still insisting that Harold talks to her through the walls. The doctors say she's incurable, lost forever in her delusions. But sometimes I wonder if she's the only one who truly understands what's happening, the only one who's seen the truth clearly. We lock her away, call her insane, but meanwhile, the building people spread. More tunnels, more watchers, more guilty souls manipulated into doing their work. The wellness check that started all this was supposed to be routine. Just checking on an elderly woman who hadn't been seen in a few days. But it opened a door to something vast and terrible lurking in the spaces we don't think about. The gaps between walls where darkness grows and feeds. I still have nightmares about Mrs. Hutchinson's apartment. About the bodies in the walls, their faces peaceful like they'd just gone to sleep. About her standing there with that knife, tears streaming down her face, begging Harold to forgive her for something she did a decade ago. But the worst nightmares are the ones where I'm back in that apartment, and I can hear them all. The victims, Harold, the building people, whispering from inside the walls. They're saying my name, listing my sins, promising forgiveness if I just do one small thing for them. Just make a little room. Just clear out the problematic ones. Just feed the building what it needs. I wake from those dreams covered in sweat, heart pounding, and I check my walls. Every night, I check my walls, because I know that somewhere, in some building, in some wall, they're still there, still watching, still hungry. And one day when my guilt gets heavy enough, when my secrets become too much to bear, I know they'll come for me. They'll whisper through my walls, promise me forgiveness, promise me peace, and God help me, part of me wants to listen. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a cold February night. I was Officer Virgil Watts, 8 years with the NYPD, working the midnight shift out of the 24th Precinct on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Dispatch relayed a noise complaint from a residential building on West 89th Street, between Columbus and Amsterdam. The caller, a woman named Edith Carmichael, said the sounds from the basement were keeping the entire building awake. "What kind of sounds?" I asked dispatch as I headed toward the address. Caller described it as rhythmic pounding, like someone hammering, but says it's been going on for 3 hours straight. Building super isn't answering his phone. These kinds of calls were common enough. Old buildings in Manhattan made all sorts of noises. Ancient radiators, settling foundations, pipes that hadn't been replaced since the Depression. Usually it was nothing that couldn't wait until morning, but 3 hours of continuous hammering was worth checking out. The building was a 6-story brownstone that had been converted to apartments decades ago. 8 units total, according to the mailboxes in the vestibule. The front door was propped open with a brick, which immediately put me on alert. In this neighborhood, in this cold, nobody left doors open. I pushed through into a narrow hallway that smelled of old wood and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn slightly. The complainant, Edith Carmichael, lived in 2A according to dispatch. I knocked, and the door opened immediately, like she'd been waiting right behind it. Edith was probably 70, wearing a quilted robe over a nightgown, her gray hair in curlers. Her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe. "Officer, thank God you're here. It's been going on all night. That hammering over and over. It's coming from the basement, but Mr. Horace won't answer his door." "Mr. Horace is the superintendent?" "Horace Blackwood, yes. He lives in the basement apartment. He's always been odd, but this is different. The sound is driving us all mad." As if on cue, I heard it. A rhythmic pounding from below, muffled but persistent. Thump, thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump, thump. It was too regular to be random, too consistent to be someone actually working on something. "How long has Mr. Blackwood been the super here?" "About 2 years. The landlord, Mrs. Gertrude Finch, hired him after the last super quit suddenly. She owns several buildings in the area." "And he's never made noise like this before?" Edith shook her head. "He's quiet as a mouse usually, keeps to himself, does his work, never bothers anyone. That's why this is so strange." I made a note to check with other tenants, but first I needed to investigate the source of the noise. "I'm going to check the basement. Do you have Mrs. Finch's contact information?" Edith gave me a phone number, and I headed for the basement stairs at the end of the hall. The door was unmarked, painted the same dingy beige as the walls. It was unlocked, which struck me as odd for a super's apartment. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind that made you grip the railing tight. That chemical smell got stronger as I descended, mixed now with something else, something organic and wrong. The hammering sound was much louder down here, echoing off concrete walls. The basement was larger than I'd expected, extending under the full footprint of the building. Pipes ran along the ceiling, wrapped in what looked like asbestos insulation. Bare bulbs provided pools of yellow light, leaving deep shadows in the corners. The super's apartment door was straight ahead, painted green with superintendent, stenciled in fading white letters. I knocked hard. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Officer Watts with the NYPD. I need you to open the door." The hammering continued without pause. Thump, thump, thump. I knocked again, louder. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to stop what you're doing and come to the door." Nothing. Just that relentless pounding. I tried the doorknob, locked, but the door was old, the frame warped with age and moisture. It would be easy enough to force, but I needed justification. I pulled out my phone and called the landlord, Gertrude Finch. She answered on the 5th ring, sounding groggy and irritated. "Yes? What is it?" I explained the situation, and her tone changed immediately. "Horace isn't answering. That's unusual. He's very responsible normally." "Mrs. Finch, I need permission to enter his apartment to check on his welfare." Yes, of course. Do whatever you need to do. I'll be there in 20 minutes." With the landlord's permission, I put my shoulder to the door. It took 3 solid hits before the old lock gave way and the door swung open. The smell hit me like a physical force, chemical and organic, but also something else, the distinct odor of death. Not fresh death, but old death, the kind that had been sealed away and was just now being released. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms from what I could see. The front room served as living area and kitchen, and it was chaos. Tools everywhere, hammers, saws, crowbars. The walls were covered in what looked like architectural drawings, but not of this building. These were drawings of other buildings, dozens of them, all with basements marked in red. The hammering was coming from the back room. I drew my weapon, announced myself again, and moved toward the sound. The bedroom door was open. Inside, I found Horace Blackwood. He was a thin man, maybe 50, with wild gray hair and thick glasses. He was kneeling on the floor, a sledgehammer in his hands, pounding rhythmically at a section of the floor that had been torn up, revealing old wooden planks beneath. "Mr. Blackwood, put the hammer down." He didn't even look up, just kept pounding. Thump, thump, thump. I could see now that he'd broken through the planks in several places, revealing darkness beneath. "Sir, I need you to stop and put the hammer down now." Finally, he paused, looking up at me with eyes that were completely vacant. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, his hands bloody from blisters that had burst. "Have to get them out," he said, his voice hoarse. "They've been down there too long. Have to get them out." "Who's down there, Mr. Blackwood?" "All of them. Everyone she put down there. Can you hear them? They're screaming." I listened, but all I heard was the settling of the old building and the distant sound of traffic. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to put the hammer down and step away from the hole." He looked at the hammer in his hands like he'd forgotten he was holding it, then let it fall with a clatter. "You don't understand. This building, all her buildings, she uses the basements. She's been doing it for years." "Who? Mrs. Finch?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Gertrude Finch. Gertie the Witch. We called her when I was a kid. My mother worked for her father back in the 60s, cleaned his buildings. She told me stories." He was rambling now, not making sense. I called for backup and an ambulance, then carefully approached the holes he'd made in the floor. I shined my flashlight down into the darkness. There was a sub-basement down there, or maybe a crawl space, about 4 feet deep from what I could see. And there was definitely something down there, though I couldn't make out what. Old furniture, maybe, or construction debris. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to come with me. We need to get you checked out by a doctor." "No!" He lunged for the hammer, but I grabbed him, pulling him back. He was surprisingly strong for someone so thin, fighting with desperate energy. "You don't understand. They're down there. I can hear them." It took backup arriving to help me restrain him. As the EMTs sedated him for transport, he kept repeating the same thing. "Check all her buildings. Check all the basements. She's been feeding them to the buildings for years." With Horace removed, I could properly investigate. The holes he'd made in the floor were rough but deliberate, focusing on one specific area. I got a better flashlight from my car and looked again. The crawl space extended further than I'd initially thought, running under the entire building. And now I could see what was down there. Not furniture, not debris. Bones. Lots of bones. I called for the forensics team and the detective squad. Within an hour, the basement was a crime scene. The forensics team carefully expanded the holes Horace had made, and what they found turned the stomach of even veteran officers. The crawl space contained human remains, multiple sets in various states of decomposition. Some were old, maybe decades, nothing but bones and scraps of clothing. Others were more recent. The newest couldn't have been more than a few months old. Detective Catherine Ross, a 20-year veteran with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes, took charge of the scene. "We're going to need to tear up this entire floor," she said, "and get cadaver dogs in here." Gertrude Finch arrived while the forensics team was working. She was not what I'd expected. I'd imagined someone old, frail maybe, but Gertrude was maybe 60, well-preserved, with perfectly styled silver hair and an expensive coat. She looked at the scene with an expression of mild annoyance, like we were inconveniencing her. "What exactly is happening here? Where's Horace?" Detective Ross explained about the remains found under the floor. I watched Gertrude's face carefully. She showed surprise, but it seemed practiced, rehearsed. "That's impossible," she said. "This building has been in my family for 70 years. I would know if—" "If what, Mrs. Finch?" "If anything untoward had happened here. Ross showed her photos of some of the remains on her tablet. Do you recognize any of these items? Clothing? Jewelry? Gertrude barely glanced at them. No. This must be some mistake. Perhaps they're from before my family owned the building. The building was constructed in 1923. Your family purchased it in 1952. Some of these remains are much more recent than that. Then I don't know what to tell you, Detective. I don't live here. I simply own the building. You hired Horace Blackwood as superintendent 2 years ago. What can you tell me about him? He had excellent references. Worked for several property management companies. Never any complaints until tonight. But something was off about her story. I pulled Ross aside. Horace said his mother worked for Gertrude's father, that he knew her as a child, called her Gertie the Witch. Ross nodded thoughtfully. Let's check his apartment more thoroughly. We found Horace's employee file in his desk. His application showed previous employment at 3 other buildings, all in Manhattan. I recognized something about the addresses. They were all in the same neighborhood, all older buildings with basements. Detective, I said, Horace mentioned checking all her buildings. Gertrude owns multiple properties. Ross's eyes sharpened. We need a list of all properties owned by Mrs. Finch. It took some pressing, but Gertrude finally provided a list. 8 buildings total, all in Manhattan, all pre-war construction with basement apartments. I think we need to check the basements of all these buildings, I said. Gertrude's composure finally cracked. That's ridiculous. You can't just... Actually, we can, Ross said. Given what we've found here, we have probable cause to search all your properties. What followed was one of the largest crime scene investigations in Manhattan history. 8 buildings, 8 basements, and in every single one, human remains in crawl spaces, sub-basements, and sealed-off areas. The total count was staggering. 43 bodies in various states of decomposition, the oldest dating back to the 1950s, the newest less than a month old. The victims varied in age and gender, but they had one thing in common. They were all people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Homeless individuals, sex workers, drug addicts, runaways. Horace Blackwood, once he was stabilized and medicated, provided a horrifying account. He'd taken the superintendent job specifically to investigate Gertrude Finch. His mother, before she died, had told him stories about the Finch family, about people disappearing into their buildings and never coming out. My mother saw things, he said during his interview. She saw Gertrude's father, Leopold Finch, bringing people into the buildings at night, always through the basement entrances. They never came out. She was too scared to say anything, but she told me, made me promise to find out the truth. And what did you find? Records, hidden in the walls of the superintendent's apartment. Leopold kept records of everyone. He thought he was feeding the buildings, keeping them strong. And Gertrude, she continued his work. The records Horace mentioned were found exactly where he said they'd be, inside the walls of the superintendent's apartment, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a false panel. Detective Ross and I went through them together in the precinct, and what we found was beyond comprehension. Leopold Finch had started what he called the feeding in 1952, the year he bought his first building. His journal, written in precise handwriting, detailed his belief that buildings were living entities that required human sacrifice to remain strong. The city is built on bones, one entry read. Every great structure demands its tribute. The ancients knew this. They buried sacrifices in their foundations. We have forgotten, and our buildings grow weak, collapse, decay. But I remember. I know what they need. The first victim had been a vagrant named Thomas, who'd been sleeping in the basement of Leopold's building. Leopold had strangled him and buried him in the crawl space, then documented how the building responded. Fewer complaints from tenants, no maintenance issues for months, full occupancy. The building is satisfied, he wrote. It grows strong on what I've given it. Over the years, Leopold had refined his methods. He would identify victims who wouldn't be missed, lure them into the basements with promises of work or shelter, kill them, and enter them in the hidden spaces of the buildings. He kept meticulous records, names when he knew them, descriptions, dates, and which building they were fed to. By the time Leopold died in 1986, he had killed 31 people. But the records didn't stop there. Gertrude's handwriting took over, younger and more aggressive than her father's careful script. Father was right. Her first entry read, "The buildings are hungry. They speak to me as they spoke to him. They tell me what they need." Gertrude had been more careful than her father, spacing out the killings, choosing victims more strategically. But she'd also been more ambitious. Where Leopold had 1 building, then 2, Gertrude had expanded to 8. Each building, according to her notes, required feeding every few years to remain healthy. Detective Ross sat back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. "This is insane. They actually believed buildings needed human sacrifice?" "The question is," I said, "did Gertrude really believe it, or was it just justification for killing?" We brought Gertrude in for formal questioning. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Pemberton, was already there when we arrived at the interrogation room. Gertrude sat perfectly composed, hands folded, expression neutral. "My client is here voluntarily," Pemberton said. "She's shocked by these discoveries and wants to help in any way she can." Ross placed the journals on the table. "Mrs. Finch, these were found in your building. This is your father's handwriting, and this," she pointed to the later entries, "appears to be yours." Gertrude didn't even look at them. "I've never seen those before in my life." "Really?" "Because handwriting analysis confirms this is your writing. Then someone has done an excellent job of forgery." Ross pulled out crime scene photos, spreading them across the table. Bodies in various states of decomposition, some mere skeletons, others more recent. 43 people, Mrs. Finch. 43 people found in your buildings." "I don't know anything about that." "Your own journal documents 12 of these killings." "That's not my journal." The interrogation went on for hours, but Gertrude never cracked. She denied everything, claimed the journals were forgeries, suggested Horace might have killed all these people himself and blamed it on her family. Her lawyer deflected every question, challenged every piece of evidence. But while Ross was interrogating Gertrude, I was back at the buildings with the forensics team. We'd found something else in the basement of the West 89th Street building, a hidden room behind the furnace. The room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, but it was clearly Gertrude's private space. More journals, these much more recent. Photographs of victims before they died. And something else. Videotapes. Gertrude had been recording the killings. The tapes were old, some going back to the early 90s when video cameras were still bulky and expensive, but the content was clear. Gertrude luring people into basements, offering them food or money or shelter. Then the attacks, quick and efficient. She used a garrote mostly, approaching from behind while they were distracted. But it was what happened after that made even hardened officers leave the room. Gertrude would talk to the bodies, explaining to them that they were serving a greater purpose, that their sacrifice would keep the building strong, keep the tenants safe. She'd then carefully position them in the crawl spaces or sub-basements, arranging them in specific patterns that seemed to have meaning only to her. In the most recent tape, dated just 3 weeks ago, she'd killed a young man who'd been living on the streets. As she positioned his body in the crawl space, she'd said something that chilled me. "The buildings are getting hungrier. They need more now. Father said this would happen as they aged. Soon, one won't be enough. Soon, they'll need multiple sacrifices. But there's so many who won't be missed. So many who can serve this purpose." We found a list in the same room. Names, addresses, descriptions, future victims. She'd been planning to accelerate the killings. With this evidence, Gertrude's denials crumbled. Faced with video of herself committing murder, even her lawyer couldn't defend her. But when she finally confessed, it wasn't what we expected. "You don't understand," she said, her composure finally cracking. "It's not murder. It's maintenance. These buildings are alive. They have needs. My father understood this. He taught me to listen to them, to hear what they required." "Mrs. Finch," Ross said, "buildings are not alive. They don't require human sacrifice." Gertrude laughed, a sound that raised the hair on my neck. "Aren't they? Every building in this city is built on death. The workers who died in construction, the people displaced for development, the ones who couldn't afford to stay when the rents went up. The city feeds on its people, detective. I just made it literal. You killed 43 people. I maintained 8 buildings for 35 years. Do you know how many people lived safely in those buildings during that time? Thousands. The sacrifice of a few for the safety of many. That's not how it works, isn't it? How many people die in building collapses every year? How many from faulty wiring, gas leaks, structural failures? My buildings never had those problems. Never. Not once in 35 years. It was true, disturbingly. When we checked the records, none of Gertrude's buildings had ever had a major incident. No fires, no collapses, no carbon monoxide deaths. They were older buildings that should have had problems, but they'd been remarkably safe. "Coincidence," Ross said, but I could see she was disturbed by it too. The media had a field day with the story. The basement killer, they called Gertrude. Manhattan's secret reaper. The buildings were evacuated, the tenants relocated. The city announced plans to demolish all 8 structures. That's when things got strange. The first building scheduled for demolition was the one on West 89th Street. The demolition crew arrived on a Monday morning, but their equipment failed. All of it, simultaneously. Hydraulic systems that had worked perfectly the day before suddenly seized. Electrical systems shorted out. Even hand tools broke inexplicably. They brought in new equipment. It failed too. Then the accident started. A demolition worker fell from a second-story window, breaking his leg. Another was hit by a falling brick, despite being nowhere near any active demolition. A third reported feeling hands push him down the basement stairs, though he was alone at the time. After a week of attempts, the demolition company refused to continue. They claimed the building was cursed. The city brought in another company. The same things happened. Equipment failures, accidents, unexplained events. Workers reported hearing voices in the walls, seeing shadows in the basements, feeling watched constantly. Meanwhile, Gertrude sat in her cell at Rikers awaiting trial. I visited her once, trying to understand. "The buildings won't let themselves be destroyed," she said, smiling. "They're strong. I made them strong. All those lives, all that essence soaked into their foundations. They're more than just buildings now." "You're insane." Am I? Or have I discovered something everyone else is too blind to see? This city, Officer Watts, is built on death. Every skyscraper, every brownstone, every project building. They all demand their tribute. I just had the courage to provide it. I left feeling unsettled. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those buildings, standing empty now, their basements full of forensic markers where bodies had been found. Were they just buildings? Or had Gertrude's madness somehow infected them, made them into something else? I went back to West 89th Street at 3 a.m. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself they were just buildings. The street was empty, the building dark. But as I stood there, I could swear I heard something from inside. Voices, whispers, the sound of footsteps on old wood. I used my flashlight to look through a ground floor window. The beam of light penetrated the darkness, illuminating the empty apartment. But for just a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. A figure, human-shaped but wrong somehow, there and then gone. I told myself it was my imagination, exhaustion from working this case. But when I got home, I found a message on my phone. No number, just static, and then a voice I recognized as Gertrude's. "They know you now, Officer Watts. You've been in their basements, walked through their halls. They can smell the death on you, the death you've uncovered. They're hungry, and you've taken away their food. Be careful. Buildings have long memories and longer reaches." I had the message analyzed. It was definitely Gertrude's voice, but she had no access to phones in jail. The recording was impossible. A week later, the first of the 8 buildings collapsed. No explosion, no demolition. It just fell. Straight down into its own basement, as if the earth had swallowed it. No one was hurt, miraculously, but when they cleared the rubble, they found something disturbing. The bodies were gone. All of them. Every single victim that had been documented, photographed, catalogued, vanished. The forensic markers were there, the evidence tags, but the remains themselves had disappeared. The same thing happened with the second building, then the third. Each one collapsed on its own, and each time, the bodies were missing from the rubble. Horace Blackwood was released from psychiatric hold after a month. The authorities determined he'd had a psychological break, but wasn't dangerous. I met him for coffee, wanting to understand what he'd experienced. "I could hear them," he said, his hands shaking as he held his cup. "In the walls, under the floors. All those people she killed. They were still there, still aware somehow, trapped in the spaces between. That's not possible, isn't it? What do we really know about death, officer? What do we know about what happens to the energy of a person when they die violently, when they're sealed away in darkness? We know they don't become ghosts in the walls." He laughed bitterly. "I lived in that basement for 2 years. Every night I heard them, scratching, whispering, crying. They wanted out. That's why I was breaking through the floor that night. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to free them." "And did you? Free them?" "I don't know. When the buildings collapsed, maybe they were finally released, or maybe they went somewhere else. Somewhere worse." By the time of Gertrude's trial, all 8 buildings had collapsed. The city couldn't explain it. Structural engineers found no reason for the collapses. They just fell, one by one, taking their secrets with them. Gertrude was convicted of 43 counts of murder, sentenced to life without parole. During her sentencing, she said something that still haunts me. "You think you've won, but you've just made them angry. All those buildings, all those souls I fed them, all that power, it has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. It finds new homes, new buildings to inhabit. You've spread the infection across the city. Every building in Manhattan will want what mine had. They'll whisper to their owners, their supers, their tenants. They'll demand their tribute, and someone will listen. Someone always listens." She was right about one thing. In the year following her conviction, there was a marked increase in deaths in basement apartments across Manhattan. Heart attacks, accidents, suicides, all explicable, all investigated and found to be natural or self-inflicted. But the pattern was there if you looked for it. I started keeping track. Buildings where multiple basement deaths occurred, buildings with histories of violence, buildings that seemed to have unusual numbers of accidents or incidents. The pattern spread from Manhattan to Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. I tried to tell Ross, but she dismissed it as paranoia. "Buildings don't kill people, Virgil. People kill people. What Gertrude did was horrible, but it was just her. Don't let her madness infect you." But I couldn't let it go. I researched every old building in the city, looking for patterns. And I found them. Buildings with hidden rooms, crawl spaces, sub-basements. Buildings with histories of disappearances. Buildings that seemed to swallow people and never let them go. 6 months after Gertrude's conviction, I was still working nights, still responding to noise complaints and domestic disturbances. But I couldn't shake what had happened. Every basement I entered, every old building I patrolled, I found myself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, looking for signs of what Gertrude had called the feeding. Then came the call that changed everything. Another noise complaint, this time from a building on East 73rd Street. The caller, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, said she heard crying from the basement, children crying, but the building had no children living in it. The building was a narrow 5-story walk-up, squeezed between 2 larger structures. It had that neglected look common to rent-controlled buildings in Manhattan, the landlord doing the bare minimum maintenance, waiting for tenants to die or move so they could renovate and raise the rents. Mrs. Klein met me in the vestibule. She was 80 if she was a day, wearing a housecoat and slippers, her white hair thin enough to see her scalp through it. "Officer, I've lived here 43 years, and I know every sound this building makes. But this is different. It started a week ago. Every night, around midnight, crying from the basement." "Is there a basement apartment?" "No, just storage and the boiler room. The super goes down there sometimes, but he says he doesn't hear anything." The super was a man named Stanley Morse, according to Mrs. Klein. He lived on the first floor, had been there about 5 years. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. "He might be out," Mrs. Klein said. "He drinks at the bar on the corner most nights." I decided to check the basement myself. Mrs. Klein gave me a key. She was on the building's tenant board and had access. The basement door was at the end of the first-floor hallway, painted industrial green and marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The moment I opened it, I smelled it. That same chemical smell from Gertrude's buildings, mixed with decay. My hand went to my weapon instinctively. The stairs were wooden, old enough that each step groaned under my weight. The basement was low-ceilinged, maybe 6 feet, forcing me to duck under pipes and ducts. A single bulb provided dim light, casting long shadows. And then I heard it. Crying. Definitely crying, but muffled, like it was coming from behind the walls. I followed the sound to the back of the basement, where an old coal bin had been converted to storage. The door was padlocked, but the crying was definitely coming from inside. I called for backup, then used my flashlight to break the lock. Inside the coal bin was another door, this one newer, recently installed. It led to a room that shouldn't exist. It extended beyond the building's footprint, under the sidewalk, or maybe into the building next door. The room was lined with soundproofing material, and in the center was a cage. Inside the cage were 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all between maybe 8 and 12 years old. They were dirty, terrified, but alive. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rage building inside me. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help." The children shrank back at first, but the girl, the oldest from the looks of her, spoke up. "He said no one would come. He said no one could hear us." "Who? Who said that?" "The man. He comes at night, brings food and water. Says we're special, that we're chosen." My backup arrived then. 2 uniforms and Detective Ross, who'd been working late on another case. When she saw the children, her face went white. "Jesus Christ, get EMS here now, and find the super." We got the children out, wrapped them in blankets, tried to comfort them while waiting for the ambulances. They'd been missing for various lengths of time. The girl, Sarah, for 2 weeks, one boy for 10 days, the other for just 3 days. All taken from different boroughs, all reported as runaways. Stanley Morse was picked up at the bar, drunk and belligerent. But when he saw the police, he tried to run. It took 3 officers to bring him down. In his pocket, we found a key to the cage and a notebook. The notebook was disturbing. Names of children, addresses, schedules. He'd been stalking them for months, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to grab them. But there was more. References to the feeding, to what the building needs, to continuing the work. In interrogation, Morse was defiant at first, claiming the children were lying, that he'd never seen them before. But when Ross showed him the notebook, his own handwriting documenting his stalking, he changed his story. "You don't understand," he said, echoing Gertrude's words. "The buildings are hungry. They've always been hungry. Mrs. Finch understood. She fed them what they needed." "You knew Gertrude Finch?" "I worked for her. Maintenance in her buildings. She taught me to listen, to hear what they wanted. When she was arrested, the buildings were angry. They spoke to others, called to us." "Us?" "Those of us who can hear them. There are more of us than you think. In every old building, there's someone who hears the whispers, feels the hunger." "You're saying buildings told you to kidnap children?" "Not just any children, special ones. Ones with energy. The buildings can sense it. They call to them, and they call to us to bring them." "Were you going to kill them?" Morse looked genuinely confused. "Kill them? No, no. The buildings don't want them dead. They want them alive, their energy, their fear. The fear feeds them more than death ever could." It was insane. But there was something about the way he said it, the absolute conviction in his voice, that made me think of Gertrude's similar certainty. Either this was an elaborate delusion shared by multiple people, or... No. Buildings weren't alive. They didn't hunger for human sacrifice or feed on fear. This was just madness, one person's delusion infecting others. But then we searched Morse's apartment and found something that challenged that certainty. Videos, dozens of them, taken with hidden cameras throughout various buildings in the city. They showed empty basements, empty hallways, empty rooms. Except they weren't empty. In each video, if you looked carefully, you could see shadows moving independently of any light source. Shapes that suggested human forms, but weren't quite right. And sounds, whispers, cries, scratching, coming from walls with nothing behind them. "Digital manipulation," Ross said, but she had the videos analyzed by experts. They were real. No editing, no special effects. Just recordings of empty spaces that weren't as empty as they appeared. Morse had more to tell us. He spoke of a network, people throughout the city who heard the building's calls. Some, like him, actively fed them. Others just listened, documented, waited. "Check the building records," he said. "Every old building in this city with a history of death, disappearance, violence, someone there knows, someone there hears." We did check, and we found a disturbing pattern. In buildings with violent histories, there were always reports of strange noises, unexplained events, and often a superintendent or long-term resident who seemed oddly protective of the building, who insisted on handling all maintenance personally, who had access to areas no one else did. I started visiting these buildings, talking to these people. Most seemed normal, dismissed the idea of living buildings as nonsense. But a few, when pressed, admitted to hearing things, feeling things. An old super in Chinatown, Mr. Chen, told me, "The building speaks in the language of settling wood and groaning pipes. You learn to interpret it. It tells you what it needs. Sometimes just maintenance, sometimes more." A landlady in the village, Mrs. Romano, said, "My grandmother owned this building. She taught me to leave offerings in the basement. Just food, usually. Sometimes a drop of blood from a pricked finger. It keeps the building calm." These people weren't killers like Gertrude or kidnappers like Morse. They were just people who'd inherited or developed a belief that their buildings were alive and needed appeasement. Harmless eccentricity mostly, but sometimes not. I found 3 more people actively feeding their buildings. One was killing animals, cats, dogs, rats, and leaving them in the walls. Another was a nurse who was stealing blood from the hospital and pouring it into the foundation. The third, most disturbingly, was a social worker who was directing vulnerable people to specific buildings where she knew they wouldn't come out. Each arrest led to more revelations. There was indeed a network, loose and informal, of people who believed buildings were living entities. They shared information online in coded forums, traded tips on feeding methods, warned each other about police attention. The FBI got involved, treating it as an organized crime investigation. But it was hard to prosecute people for believing buildings were alive. Most hadn't committed any crimes beyond minor animal cruelty or theft. The few who had killed or kidnapped, like Morse, were prosecuted, but the network itself persisted. I became obsessed with understanding it. I read everything: architecture history, urban legends, psychological studies on mass delusion. I found references going back centuries to the idea of living buildings. In medieval times, it was common to bury animals or even people in foundations to strengthen the structure. Some cultures still practiced forms of this, blessing buildings with blood or other offerings. Dr. Helena Voss, a psychiatrist specializing in collective delusions, had a theory. "Cities are overwhelming," she told me. "Millions of people crammed together in structures of steel and stone. It's natural to anthropomorphize these structures, to give them personality, needs, desires. It makes the urban environment feel less alien, more manageable." But these people actually believe it. Belief is powerful. If enough people believe something, it shapes behavior, creates patterns. These people aren't necessarily delusional in the clinical sense. They're participating in a shared mythology that gives meaning to urban life. A mythology that involves murder. Unfortunately, yes. All mythologies have their extremists. I wanted to accept her explanation, to file this away as a mass delusion, a modern urban cult. But there were things that didn't fit. The synchronized collapse of Gertrude's buildings, the videos showing shadows and sounds that shouldn't exist, the fact that buildings with violent histories did seem to have more accidents, more deaths, more unexplained events. Late one night, I went back to the site where Gertrude's first building had stood. It was just a vacant lot now, cordoned off with chain-link fence. The city hadn't decided what to do with the land yet. I stood there in the darkness, looking at the depression where the basement had been, and I heard it, or thought I did. Whispers from underground, scratches like fingernails on wood, a sound like breathing from lungs made of brick and mortar. I told myself it was the wind, the sound of the city at night, my imagination shaped by too much exposure to this case. But I also understood, in that moment, how someone could believe. How someone already isolated, maybe mentally fragile, living alone in an old building full of strange sounds, could start to hear patterns, messages, demands. The city was full of such people. Lonely supers in basement apartments, elderly tenants who'd lived in the same building for decades. People whose lives had become so intertwined with their structures that the boundary between self and building blurred. Most were harmless. They left their offerings of food or incense, talked to their walls, believed their buildings protected them in return. It was no different, really, from any other superstition. But some heard darker demands. Some believed their buildings required more than token offerings. And in a city of 8 million people, with thousands of old buildings, even a tiny percentage meant dozens, maybe hundreds, of people who might be willing to kill for their structures. The official investigation wound down after 6 months. Morse was convicted, sentenced to life. Several others were prosecuted for related crimes. The FBI monitored the online forums, shut down the most extreme ones. The story faded from the news, replaced by other horrors, but I kept my own files. I tracked every suspicious death in a basement, every disappearance near an old building, every report of strange sounds from walls. The patterns were there if you looked for them, and sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, a modern building with no history, no basement, I would lie awake listening to the sounds of the structure around me. The ping of heating pipes, the creak of settling frames, the whisper of air through vents. And I would wonder, what if they were right? What if buildings did develop something like consciousness after decades of human habitation, human emotion, human death? What if the city itself was a vast organism, and we were just parasites living in its body, occasionally required to pay rent and blood? I would shake off these thoughts, tell myself I was letting the case get to me. But the doubt remained, because once you've heard buildings speak, or think you have, you can never quite unhear them. The city sounds different now. Every groan of old wood, every whistle of wind through stone, every echo in an empty hallway might be something more. Might be a building expressing its needs, its hungers, its anger at being ignored. I still respond to noise complaints, still enter basements and check empty buildings, but now I listen differently. I listen for what might be hiding in the sounds of urban life. And sometimes, just sometimes, I leave a small offering, a piece of bread, a splash of coffee, in the basements I visit. Just in case. Because in a city built on so much death, so much suffering, so much human energy compressed into structures of steel and stone, who's to say what might develop in the spaces between walls, in the darkness under floors, in the hollow places where nobody looks? Who's to say the buildings aren't listening? 3 years had passed since the arrest of Stanley Morse and the uncovering of what the media had called the building cult. I'd been promoted to detective, partly because of my work on the case, partly because the department wanted someone keeping an eye on similar incidents. They'd created a special unit, officially called the Urban Structural Crimes Division, unofficially known as the Ghost Building Squad. We investigated any crime that seemed connected to the building cult mythology. Most were ordinary crimes with perpetrators trying to use the cult as an excuse or insanity defense. But occasionally, we found true believers, people who genuinely thought buildings were alive and hungry. It was a cold November night when everything came full circle. I got a call from Edith Carmichael, the woman who'd made the original noise complaint about Horace Blackwood 3 years ago. She was in a nursing home now, but still sharp, still paying attention. "Detective Watts? I know you told me to call if I ever heard anything about the old buildings. Well, there's something happening. My granddaughter, she works in city planning. She told me they're going to build on those lots where Gertrude's buildings collapsed." This was news to me. The lots had been tied up in legal battles, families of victims suing the estate, the city arguing about liability, developers circling like vultures. What are they planning to build? Luxury condos. 8 buildings, 1 on each site. The developer is calling it the Renaissance Project. But detective, the developer's name is Finch, Theodore Finch. My blood went cold. Related to Gertrude? Her nephew, apparently, from her brother's side. He's been quietly buying up the land rights, settling with the families. He's got permits to start construction next month. I hung up and immediately started researching Theodore Finch. He was young, maybe 35, a successful real estate developer with projects throughout the city. Clean record, no connection to the building cult that we could find. But the fact that he was building on those specific sites. I went to see Gertrude in prison. She was older now, frailer, but her eyes were still sharp. When I told her about Theodore, she smiled. "Teddy, my brother's boy, smart kid. He understands." "Understands what?" "That you can't fight the buildings. You can only serve them or be consumed by them. Those sites are special now, you see. All that death, all that energy, it's soaked into the ground. Whatever gets built there will be powerful." I won't let him continue your work." She laughed. "It's not my work, Detective. It never was. It's the city's work, the building's work. I was just a servant, and there will always be more servants." I left the prison determined to stop Theodore Finch, but legally, there was nothing I could do. He owned the land, had all the permits, wasn't doing anything wrong. I couldn't arrest someone for being related to a serial killer, but I could investigate. I started looking into Theodore's other properties. He owned 12 buildings throughout Manhattan, all acquired in the last 5 years. And in each building, there had been at least one death in the basement or lower floors since he'd acquired it. All explicable. Heart attacks, suicides, accidents. But the pattern was there. I visited one of his buildings, a renovated brownstone in the East Village. The super, an elderly man named Francis Waltham, was eager to talk. "Mr. Finch is a good landlord," he said, but his hands shook as he spoke. "Pays well, fixes things promptly. He just has specific requirements." "What kind of requirements?" Francis looked around nervously, then led me to his apartment. Inside, he showed me a manual Theodore had given him. Building Maintenance and Care was the title, but the content was disturbing. Instructions on feeding schedules, energy management, resident screening for compatibility. "He wants me to report any residents who seem energetically incompatible with the building," Francis explained. "People who complain too much, who fight the building's nature." "And what happens to these people?" "They leave, always voluntarily, but they leave. And sometimes, before they go, there are accidents, minor ones usually. Falls, electrical shocks, things that make them want to leave." "The building causes these accidents?" Francis's hands shook harder. "I don't know what causes them. I just know they happen. And Mr. Finch, he always knows when they're going to happen. He'll call me, tell me to check on someone, and when I do, they've just had an accident." I took the manual as evidence, but my captain wasn't impressed. "It's weird, but it's not illegal to have strange beliefs about building maintenance. Unless you can prove Theodore Finch is actually causing these accidents, we have nothing." But I kept digging. I found that Theodore had studied architecture and urban planning, but his thesis had been rejected from 3 universities for its content. I managed to get a copy from a friend in academia. The thesis was titled Sympathetic Architecture, the Living Building Theory. In it, Theodore argued that buildings, through prolonged human habitation, developed a form of consciousness, not true awareness, but a kind of reactive intelligence that responded to the emotions and energies of residents. He cited historical examples, architectural anomalies, and most disturbingly, his Aunt Gertrude's work. He praised her as a pioneer who understood the symbiotic relationship between buildings and humans. He argued that by feeding buildings properly, not necessarily with death, but with the right kind of human energy, they could be made safer, stronger, more valuable. The construction on the first of the 8 sites began in December. I watched from across the street as they broke ground. Theodore was there, dressed in an expensive suit, talking to the construction foreman. But what caught my attention was what he did when he thought no one was looking. He poured something into the foundation pit. Later, when the crew had gone home, I snuck onto the site and took a sample. The lab results were disturbing. Human blood mixed with various organic compounds. Not enough to prove murder, the blood could have come from anywhere, but enough to show that Theodore was continuing his family's traditions. Over the next months, I documented everything. Theodore visiting the construction sites at night, performing what looked like rituals. Workers reporting strange sounds from the foundations. 3 construction workers quitting after claiming they'd seen faces in the concrete. Then came the accidents. A worker fell from scaffolding that had been inspected that morning and found secure. Another was crushed when a wall collapsed despite being properly braced. A third had a heart attack in the basement, despite being 28 and in perfect health. After each accident, Theodore would visit the site, spend hours in the basement or foundation, and construction would resume with no further incidents. It was as if he was negotiating with the building, calming it. I brought all this to the FBI, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. But without concrete proof of crime, no one would act. Theodore was too smart, too careful. Everything could be explained away as coincidence or accident. The first building was completed in September. The Finch Tower, a gleaming 8-story luxury condo. The apartment sold immediately, despite the history of the land. Or perhaps because of it. Theodore marketed it as transformation, turning a site of tragedy into one of renewal. The first residents moved in October. Within a week, I got a call from one of them, a young professional named Jennifer Walsh. "Detective Watts, I got your name from a news article about the building cult. I think there's something wrong with my apartment." I met her at a coffee shop near the building. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "I know this sounds crazy, but I can hear things in the walls. Voices, crying, scratching, and the dreams. God, the dreams. Every night I dream about the people who died here. They show me how they died over and over." "Have you talked to the building management?" "Yes, to Mr. Finch himself. He said it was just the building settling, that new constructions make odd noises, but then he offered to buy my apartment back for twice what I paid for it." "Twice?" "Yes. That's not normal, right? Why would he do that unless he knew something was wrong?" I convinced Jennifer to let me inspect her apartment. It was beautiful. High ceilings, exposed brick, modern fixtures. But there was something off about it. The temperature dropped noticeably near the walls. My EMF detector, which I'd started carrying after the Morse case, went crazy near the corners where walls met. And in the bedroom, behind a built-in bookshelf, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small hole in the wall, maybe an inch in diameter. Inside, visible only with a flashlight, was a human tooth embedded in what looked like concrete mixed with organic matter. I had the building inspected, citing potential structural issues. The inspector found more teeth, fragments of bone, human hair mixed into the concrete at various points. Not enough to constitute human remains, but enough to suggest Theodore had mixed biological material from the original victims into the new construction. "It's like he's trying to transfer something from the old buildings to the new," the inspector said. "Like he thinks the victim's essence will make the new buildings, I don't know, more like the old ones." Theodore was brought in for questioning but remained calm. "Those materials were in the ground when we excavated," he said. "Given the history of the sites, finding human remains isn't surprising. We followed all protocols for handling such discoveries." "You mixed them into your concrete." "That's absurd. Any contamination was accidental. Multiple residents are reporting disturbances. New buildings settle. People who know the history get spooked. It's psychological." He had an answer for everything, delivered with a slight smile that reminded me painfully of his aunt. By the time all 8 buildings were complete, the pattern was undeniable. Every building had incidents, residents reporting strange sounds, sudden temperature drops, feelings of being watched. The turnover rate was astronomical. People would move in, last a few weeks or months, then leave, often taking significant financial losses to get out. But some residents stayed, and these people, I noticed, were different. They spoke about their buildings with an odd affection, even reverence. They left offerings in the basements, flowers, food, sometimes drops of their own blood from accidental cuts. They formed building committees that met in secret, discussing things like energy balance and structural happiness. I realized Theodore wasn't trying to hide the building's nature. He was selecting for residents who would accept it, even embrace it. He was creating a network of people who would willingly serve these structures. The breaking point came when a child went missing in the Finch Tower. 5-year-old Michael Chen, playing in the basement recreation room while his mother was in the laundry room next door. Security footage showed him entering the rec room but never leaving. He'd simply vanished. I led the search, tearing apart every inch of that basement. We found a hidden space behind the boiler room, accessible only through a panel that looked solid but pushed inward. Inside was Michael, unconscious but alive, along with something else. The walls of the hidden room were covered in writing, but not in any ink or paint. The words seemed to be formed from the concrete itself, raised letters that hadn't been there when the building was constructed. They were names, all the names of Gertrude's victims, repeated over and over. And at the center, written larger than the rest, "We remain, we hunger, we wait." Michael recovered, but had no memory of how he'd gotten into the room. The panel had no handle on the inside. He couldn't have closed it himself. Someone, or something, had put him there. This was finally enough to act. Theodore was arrested for child endangerment and false imprisonment. The hidden room was evidence of deliberate construction of dangerous spaces. During the trial, more evidence emerged. Theodore's communications with remaining building cult members, his attempts to recreate his aunt's feeding schedule, his belief that he could create evolved buildings that would be partners with humanity rather than simple structures. He was convicted, sentenced to 15 years. The 8 buildings were condemned, scheduled for demolition. This time, the city brought in experts who understood what they were dealing with. The buildings were demolished piece by piece, with religious leaders from various faiths performing blessings at each stage. The debris was scattered, mixed with salt and iron filings, old superstitions, but the workers insisted. The lots remain empty to this day. The city turned them into small parks, memorials to the victims. But even now, people report strange experiences there. Voices on the wind, shadows that don't match any objects, the feeling of being inside even while standing in open space. I retired last year, but I still visit those parks sometimes. I leave flowers for the victims, all of them. Gertrude's victims, Theodore's victims, and all the unknown ones who might have fed buildings throughout the city's history. Because the truth I've come to accept is this: whether buildings are truly alive or not doesn't matter. What matters is that enough people believe they are, and that belief shapes reality. In a city built on generations of human experience, emotion, and death, the line between the psychological and the physical blurs. Buildings absorb our fears, our hopes, our deaths. They become repositories of human experience, and sometimes, maybe, that accumulation of experience becomes something like consciousness. Not life as we understand it, but something else. Something that watches, waits, and occasionally hungries. The building cult was broken up, its leaders imprisoned or scattered. But the buildings remain. Millions of them, throughout the city, throughout the world. Each one soaking up the lives lived within its walls, becoming more than mere stone and steel. I live in a new building now, one with no history, no deaths, no hidden spaces. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the walls settling, adjusting, finding their voice. And I wonder how long it takes for a building to wake up. How many years of human habitation before it starts to listen, to learn, to hunger. I leave small offerings, breadcrumbs on the windowsill, a splash of wine in the sink, just in case. Because in a city this old, this full of history and death, you can never be too careful. The city is built on bones, as Leopold Finch wrote, and bones sometimes remember. The dispatcher's voice came through my radio at 3:15 p.m. on a scorching hot Tuesday afternoon in July. I was Officer Gladys Mitchell, working out of the 109th Precinct in Queens, and I just finished writing up a parking violation when the call came in. Unit 12, we have a property dispute at 4218 Parsons Boulevard. Neighbor complaint, possible escalation. Complainant is still on scene. I acknowledged the call and headed toward the address, a residential area in Flushing where the houses were packed so tight you could practically reach out your window and touch your neighbor's wall. These kinds of calls were common in summer when the heat made everyone irritable and property lines suddenly became fighting words. The house was a modest two-story colonial, painted white but yellowing with age. The lawn was immaculate, every blade of grass exactly the same height, bordered by a chain-link fence that looked new. Standing in the driveway were two men, both red-faced and gesticulating wildly. One was heavy-set, maybe 60, wearing a sweat-stained undershirt. The other was thinner, older, probably 70, dressed in pressed khakis despite the heat. I parked and approached them, already feeling the tension radiating off both men like heat from asphalt. "Gentlemen, I'm Officer Mitchell. Someone called about a dispute?" The heavy-set man immediately started talking, his voice loud and aggressive. "This bastard here, Elmer Hutchins, he's trying to steal my land. Been moving his fence a few inches every month, thinking I wouldn't notice." The older man, Elmer, remained calm, but I could see his jaw clenching. "Officer, my name is Elmer Hutchins, and I've owned this property for 37 years. Mr. Harold Kowalski here moved in last year and has been harassing me ever since. The fence is exactly where it's always been, on my property line, as established by the original survey from 1985. Harold's face got redder. "Bullshit! I had my own survey done. That fence is 2 feet over on my property, 2 whole feet. I held up my hand to calm them both. "All right, let's take this one step at a time. Mr. Kowalski, when did you have your survey done?" 3 weeks ago. Cost me $800, but it was worth it to prove this thief has been stealing my land." Elmer shook his head slowly. "Officer, I have all the original documentation inside. Property deeds, surveys, everything. Would you like to see them?" "That would be helpful, Mr. Hutchins." Harold immediately objected. "Oh, sure. Go inside with him where he can show you his fake documents. I have my survey right here." He pulled out a folded paper from his pocket, damp with sweat. I looked at both men, noting how Harold's hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or something else I couldn't tell. Elmer seemed composed, but there was something in his eyes, a hardness that suggested this wasn't his first confrontation. "How about we all go inside together, look at both sets of documents?" I suggested. "I'm not setting foot in that house," Harold spat. "Who knows what he's got in there?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Elmer's calm facade cracked slightly. "You know exactly what I mean. I've seen the people coming and going at all hours. I know what you're up to." This was escalating beyond a simple property dispute. I needed to separate them and get individual statements. "Mr. Kowalski, why don't you wait by your property while I review Mr. Hutchins' documents? Then I'll come look at yours." Harold grumbled but agreed, stomping off toward his house, which was right next door, separated by the disputed fence. I noticed a woman watching from Harold's front window, presumably his wife, her face pinched with worry. Elmer led me into his house, and immediately I understood why Harold might be suspicious. The place was immaculate to an unsettling degree. Everything was perfectly aligned, from the shoes by the door to the magazines on the coffee table. It smelled strongly of bleach and air freshener, like someone had just done a deep clean. "My office is this way," Elmer said, leading me down a hallway lined with framed photographs. They were all of property, aerial views, boundary markers, surveyor's equipment. Not a single family photo. His office was filled with filing cabinets, each labeled with dates and property addresses. He pulled out a thick folder marked with his address and handed it to me. "Everything you need is here. Original purchase documents from 1987, survey from 1985 when the previous owner bought it, Another survey from 1992 when I had the fence installed, and the permit for said fence from the city. I reviewed the documents. Everything seemed legitimate, properly notarized and filed. The surveys clearly showed the fence on Elmer's property, well within his boundary lines. Mr. Hutchins, Harold mentioned people coming and going. What's that about? Elmer's expression darkened. I'm a property consultant. I help people with boundary disputes, title searches, that sort of thing. Sometimes clients come to my home office. Harold has decided this means I'm running some sort of criminal enterprise. And these disputes you help with, are any of them in this neighborhood? He hesitated just a moment too long. A few. Property disputes are common in areas where houses are close together. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I thanked him for the documents and went to check with Harold. Harold's house was the complete opposite of Elmer's. Cluttered, lived in, with children's toys scattered on the lawn despite Harold being too old to have young kids. His wife, Agnes, met me at the door. She was a small woman, probably mid-50s, with nervous eyes. Officer, thank God you're here. This situation has gotten completely out of hand. Harold showed me his survey, which did indeed show the fence encroaching on his property. But when I looked closer, I noticed something odd. The surveyor's company stamp was slightly smudged, and the date seemed to have been altered. Mr. Kowalski, who did this survey? Brennan Surveying. Found them online. Why? I made a note to check on Brennan Surveying. Have you had any other issues with Mr. Hutchins besides the fence? Agnes and Harold exchanged a look. Agnes spoke up. Tell her about the cameras. What cameras? Harold pointed to Elmer's house. He's got cameras everywhere, pointing at our property, our windows. And at night, I swear I've seen him out there measuring things, taking photos. When was this? Multiple times over the past month, always around 2 or 3 in the morning. I work nights sometimes, so I'm up. I've seen him out there with a measuring tape and some kind of device, like a surveyor's equipment. This was getting stranger. I made more notes and told them I'd need to verify some information and would be back. As I was leaving, Agnes grabbed my arm. Officer, there's something else. We had a neighbor, Mrs. Garrett, lived 2 houses down. She had a property dispute with someone last year. She ended up moving suddenly, said she couldn't take the harassment anymore. The person she was disputing with? They'd hired Elmer as a consultant. I got Mrs. Garrett's forwarding information from Agnes and decided to pay Elmer another visit. This time I noticed more details. Security cameras on every corner of his house, all angles covered. A surveyor's transit in the garage, professional grade. And in his backyard, small flags marking various points, creating a grid pattern across his lawn. Mr. Hutchins, I need to ask you about Mrs. Garrett. His face remained neutral. Dorothy Garrett. Yes, I consulted on her case. Unfortunate situation. Her neighbor was clearly in the wrong, but Dorothy didn't have the stomach for a legal battle. Agnes Kowalski says Mrs. Garrett was harassed until she moved. I wouldn't know about that. I simply provided documentation showing the true property lines. And what happened to the property after she moved? I believe it was sold to someone who understood proper boundaries. The way he said it made me uncomfortable. I decided to do some digging. Back at the precinct, I pulled property records for the entire block. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, 6 properties on that street had changed hands after disputes. In every case, Elmer had been involved as a consultant for one party. And in every case, the property had eventually been sold to someone Elmer had recommended. I called Mrs. Dorothy Garrett at her new number in New Jersey. She sounded tired, defeated. That man is evil, she said without preamble when I mentioned Elmer's name. He doesn't just consult, he orchestrates. He finds tiny discrepancies in property lines, then helps one neighbor weaponize them against another. The harassment starts small. Security lights that shine into windows, legal but annoying construction at odd hours, Constant surveying and measuring that makes you feel watched. Did you go to the police? With what? Everything he does is legal. Every complaint I made was dismissed as a civil matter. But living next to that constant psychological warfare, I couldn't take it. I sold for less than my house was worth just to get away. Who bought your house? A company called Parsons Property Holdings. I looked them up later. They're connected to Elmer somehow, though I could never prove it. I thanked Mrs. Garrett and continued my investigation. Parsons Property Holdings was a legitimate company, but its ownership was hidden behind layers of LLCs. However, one name kept appearing in the paperwork: Horace Hutchins, Elmer's brother. The pattern was clear. Elmer would identify properties with minor boundary issues, help escalate disputes until one party gave up and sold. Then his brother's company would buy the property at a reduced price. It was brilliant, malicious, and completely legal. But Harold Kowalski wasn't backing down like the others had. And that, I was starting to realize, was making the situation dangerous. I returned to Parsons Boulevard that evening to find Harold in his front yard with a sledgehammer, preparing to tear down the fence. "Mr. Kowalski, stop. You can't destroy property without a court order. It's on my land. My survey says so." Elmer had come out of his house and was filming everything with his phone. "Officer Mitchell, I want him arrested for destruction of property." "I haven't destroyed anything yet," Harold shouted. "Attempted destruction, then, and this is the third time this week he's threatened my property." I stepped between them. "Everyone needs to calm down. Mr. Kowalski, put the sledgehammer down. This needs to be handled through civil court." Harold's face was purple with rage. "Civil court? You know how much that costs? He knows I can't afford it. That's his game." "Then I need to protect what's mine." Harold swung the sledgehammer, not at the fence, but at one of Elmer's security cameras mounted on a post. It shattered in a spray of plastic and glass. Now I had no choice. "Mr. Kowalski, you're under arrest for destruction of property." As I cuffed Harold, with Agnes crying in the doorway, Elmer stood there with a small, satisfied smile. He'd won this round. But something in Harold's eyes as I led him to my patrol car told me this wasn't over. "You don't know what he's capable of," Harold said quietly. "Check his basement, officer. Check what he's got down there." Elmer heard him, and his smile widened. "Defamation now, too? My attorney will be interested in that." I took Harold to the precinct for booking, but his words stayed with me. That night, I pulled more records. Elmer Hutchins had no criminal record, but there were dozens of civil suits, all property-related. He'd won every single one. There was also a death certificate from 1993. Elmer's first wife, Patricia, had died in a fall down the basement stairs. Accidental, according to the report. They'd been in the middle of a divorce at the time, disputing the division of property. The next morning, Harold was released on bail. Agnes called me an hour later, hysterical. Harold had gone back to the house with a shovel, saying he was going to dig up proof of what Elmer was doing. She couldn't stop him. I rushed over to find Harold in his backyard, digging along the fence line. He'd already made a hole about 3 feet deep. Elmer was standing on his side of the fence, still filming, still wearing that satisfied smile. "Mr. Kowalski, you need to stop digging," I called out. But Harold was beyond listening. Sweat poured down his face as he attacked the earth with desperate energy. "There's something down here!" he shouted. "I know there is! Last night I heard digging from his side. He's hiding something!" Elmer just stood there, recording everything. "Officer Mitchell, this is destruction of property. He's damaging the fence posts." I climbed over into Harold's yard to physically stop him, but as I got closer, his shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. A metallic clang rang out. Harold dropped to his knees, scraping dirt away with his bare hands. "What the hell?" he muttered. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, rusted but intact. Harold pulled it free and fumbled with the latch. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic. Old documents, from the look of them. "Don't touch those," Elmer said sharply, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "Those are on my property." "The hell they are. They're on my side of where the real property line should be." Harold pulled out the documents, his dirty hands leaving smears on the plastic. I moved closer to see what he'd found. They were property deeds, surveys, and something else. Photographs. Black and white photos of the houses on this street, but from decades ago. In one photo, there was no fence at all between the properties, and the boundary was marked by a row of stones that ran in a completely different line than either current survey showed. "Mr. Hutchins," I said slowly, "what are these?" Elmer's jaw was clenched tight. "Historical documents. I collect them. For my work." "Buried in my yard?" Harold demanded. "That's not your yard, and I buried them for safekeeping." But there was more in the box. A notebook, also wrapped in plastic. Harold opened it before I could stop him, and his face went pale as he read. This is a record of every property on this street. Notes about the owners, their finances, their weaknesses." He flipped through pages. "Listen to this. Dorothy Garrett, widow, fixed income, children estranged, vulnerable to pressure about maintenance costs." I took the notebook from him. It was exactly what Harold described. Detailed intelligence on every homeowner on the street, going back years. Notes about their financial situations, family problems, legal vulnerabilities. It was like a playbook for psychological warfare. "Mr. Hutchins, I'm going to need you to come to the station and answer some questions." "I'm not going anywhere," Elmer said firmly. "Those documents are my property, stolen from my land." "Your land?" Harold was shaking with rage now. "This notebook proves you've been running a con game for years, engineering property disputes to force people out of their homes." Agnes had come outside, along with several other neighbors who'd heard the commotion. Word spreads fast on a street like this, and soon there were a dozen people gathered around, all former targets or potential targets of Elmer's schemes. "Is it true?" asked Mrs. Mildred from across the street. "Were you planning to come after my property next?" She pointed at the notebook. "Is my name in there?" Harold flipped through the pages. Mildred Thompson, retired teacher, pension plus Social Security. House needs new roof. Possible code violations in unpermitted bathroom renovation, 1998. He looked up at her. "Yeah, you're in here." The crowd was getting agitated. Elmer took a step back toward his house, but stopped when he saw more neighbors coming from that direction too. "This proves nothing," Elmer said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "These are simply notes for my consulting business." "Consulting business?" An elderly man named Walter pushed through the crowd. "You told me my garage was 6 inches over the property line and threatened to sue unless I paid you $5,000 to consult on a solution. That was a legitimate boundary issue. That mysteriously went away after I paid you. I needed to get control of the situation before it turned into a mob." "Everyone needs to calm down. Mr. Hutchins, I'm taking this notebook as evidence. You can come voluntarily or—" "Officer Mitchell!" Agnes's scream cut through everything. I turned to see Harold on the ground, clutching his chest. His face was gray, sweat pouring off him despite the sudden cool breeze that had kicked up. "Call 911!" I shouted, rushing to Harold's side. I started chest compressions while Agnes sobbed beside me. The crowd backed away, except for Elmer, who stood there watching with an unreadable expression. The paramedics arrived in minutes, but it felt like hours. They worked on Harold, got his heart beating again, loaded him into the ambulance. Agnes went with them, but not before turning to Elmer with pure hatred in her eyes. "If he dies, it's murder. You killed him with this torture, this constant stress." Elmer said nothing, just walked back to his house. The crowd dispersed slowly, everyone eyeing Elmer's property with a mixture of fear and anger. I took the notebook and the box of documents back to the precinct. What I found in them over the next several hours was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Elmer had been systematically identifying property vulnerabilities, creating disputes, and then profiting from the chaos. But everything he'd done was technically legal, unethical, immoral, but legal. Detective Raymond Burke, a veteran with 30 years on the force, reviewed the evidence with me. "It's clever," he said grudgingly. "He never actually threatens anyone, never breaks any laws. He just creates situations where people feel so pressured they leave voluntarily. But the false surveys, Harold's survey showing the fence in the wrong place? Can you prove Elmer created it, or even knew about it? Harold said he found the surveyor online. Could have been a coincidence." But I knew it wasn't. I spent the rest of my shift digging into Brennan Surveying. The company existed only on paper, registered just a month before Harold hired them. The address led to an empty office in a strip mall. The phone number went to a burner phone that was no longer in service. That night, unable to sleep, I drove past Parsons Boulevard. Elmer's house was dark except for one light in what I now knew was his office. I parked down the street and watched. At exactly 2 a.m., Elmer came out with his surveying equipment, just as Harold had described. He set it up in his backyard and began taking measurements, making notes in a small book. I called for backup and approached him. "Mr. Hutchins, what are you doing?" He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Surveying my property, officer. Nothing illegal about that." "At 2 in the morning?" I suffer from insomnia. This relaxes me. "The way targeting your neighbors relaxes you?" He smiled then, that same satisfied smile from earlier. "Officer Mitchell, you seem to be taking this personally. That's unprofessional. A man is in the hospital because of your games. Because of his own temper and poor health choices. I didn't force him to dig holes in his yard or work himself into a heart attack. I wanted to arrest him right there. But for what? Night surveying? Being a sociopath? Neither was illegal. Mr. Hutchins, I know what you're doing. Others know now, too. It's over." He packed up his equipment methodically. "Officer, do you know why property disputes are so effective at destroying people? It's because a home isn't just property. It's security, identity, legacy. When you threaten someone's boundaries, you threaten their very sense of self. The beauty is, everyone has boundaries that can be questioned. Even you. Is that a threat? Simply an observation. For instance, did you know the apartment building you live in has an interesting history? Built in 1962 on land that was seized through eminent domain. The original owners fought it for years. Their descendants still have a claim, technically. Wouldn't stand up in court, probably, but the process of fighting it could take years. Years of uncertainty, legal fees, stress. My blood went cold. How do you know where I live? Public records officer. It's all public records. He walked back to his house, leaving me standing in his backyard. The next morning, I found an envelope under my apartment door. Inside were property records for my building with certain sections highlighted. Questions about the original seizure, potential irregularities in the title transfer. I took it to Detective Burke. He's threatening me now. Burke examined the documents. He's showing you information, all publicly available, no explicit threat. Come on, Ray. You know what this is. I know what it is, but knowing and proving are different things. My advice? Move. Get out of his reach. And let him win? Sometimes winning means surviving, Gladys. But I couldn't let it go. I visited Harold in the hospital. He was stable but weak, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Agnes sat beside him, holding his hand. We're moving, she told me. As soon as he's well enough. I don't care about the house anymore. I just want my husband alive. Harold squeezed her hand. "Don't let him win, honey." "He's already won. We're broken." I showed them what Elmer had left at my apartment. Harold studied the documents with the eye of someone who'd become an expert in property law through necessity. "He made a mistake," Harold said suddenly. "What?" "Look here, these documents he gave you. Some of them aren't publicly available. This title transfer from 1962? This is from private archives. He would have had to break in or bribe someone to get this. It was thin, but it was something. I got a warrant to search Elmer's house, specifically his office." He watched calmly as we went through his files, finding nothing immediately incriminating. But then one of the officers found a hidden panel in his desk. Inside were dozens of USB drives, each labeled with an address. The digital forensics team found a gold mine, hacked email accounts, illegally obtained financial records, even recordings from hidden cameras he'd placed in neighbors' yards. It was enough to arrest him for multiple counts of illegal surveillance, identity theft, and fraud. As I cuffed him, Elmer remained calm. "This won't stick. My lawyer will have me out in hours." "Maybe. But now everyone knows what you are. Your game is over." He smiled. "Officer Mitchell, you still don't understand. This isn't my game. I'm just one player. Property is power, and there are hundreds like me, thousands. We're consultants, lawyers, developers. We understand that space is finite and valuable, and we know how to take it from those too weak or too principled to defend it properly." 2 years passed before I heard the name Elmer Hutchins again. I'd been promoted to sergeant by then, working out of a different precinct in the Bronx. The call came from a detective in Newark. They'd found a body in a property that traced back to Boulevard Holdings, LLC, the company that had bought Elmer's house. The victim was a man named Roger Fitzgerald, 68 years old, found dead in the basement of a house he'd been disputing ownership of. The cause of death was a heart attack, but the circumstances were suspicious. He'd been locked in the basement for at least 2 days before his heart gave out. The house was in the middle of a complex property dispute involving 3 different parties, each claiming ownership through different chains of title. "We found your name in the files," Detective Maria Santos told me over the phone. "Notes about the Parsons Boulevard case, about Elmer Hutchins. We think he might be involved, operating under a new identity." I drove to Newark that afternoon. The house was in a neighborhood similar to Parsons Boulevard. Working class, houses close together, the kind of place where property lines mattered because every inch counted. Detective Santos, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, met me at the scene. "Roger Fitzgerald was a retired mechanic," she explained as we walked through the house. "He inherited this place from his aunt 6 months ago. That's when the dispute started. 2 other parties claimed the aunt had promised or sold the house to them. The paperwork was a mess. Conflicting deeds, questionable signatures, the works. Where does Elmer fit in?" One of the claimants hired a property consultant named Edmund Hopkins. Physical description matches Elmer Hutchins, but we can't find any photos of Hopkins to confirm. He's been advising the claimant on how to pressure Fitzgerald into abandoning his claim. The basement where Roger died was accessible only from outside through metal storm doors. Someone had put a padlock on the outside while he was down there investigating what he thought was a water leak. There was no water leak, just a timer that turned a valve on and off, creating the sound of dripping. "He had his cell phone," Santos continued, "but no signal in the basement. The walls are lined with some kind of metal mesh that blocks signals. That's not standard construction." I studied the basement, noting details that felt familiar. The obsessive organization, everything aligned perfectly. Labels on everything, even the exposed pipes. And in the corner, surveying equipment. "This is him," I said. "This is Elmer's work." We tried to track down Edmund Hopkins, but he'd vanished just like Elmer had. The address he'd given his client was fake, the phone number disconnected. The client, a woman named Barbara Thornton, claimed she'd never met him in person. Everything was done through emails and phone calls. He said Roger was unstable, Barbara told us, visibly shaken. Said he might hurt himself to make me look guilty. When Roger went missing, I thought he'd just left town. Did Hopkins ever suggest you do anything to Roger? No, never. He just said to document everything, record our interactions, build a legal case. He said Roger would crack under the pressure eventually. But Roger hadn't cracked. He'd fought back, started investigating Hopkins, which is probably why he ended up locked in that basement. We found Roger's notes in his car. He'd been tracking property disputes across 3 states, all with similar patterns, all with mysterious consultants who disappeared after chaos ensued. He was building a case, Santos said. Look at this. Roger had created a timeline showing dozens of property disputes over the past 5 years. In each case, a consultant appeared, escalated the conflict, and then vanished after someone died, disappeared, or gave up their claim. The properties were then quickly sold to various LLCs, all with generic names that led nowhere. It's a network, I said. Elmer wasn't lying about that. They're organized. We spent weeks investigating, following paper trails, interviewing victims who'd survived these property wars. A pattern emerged. The consultants all used similar tactics: detailed surveillance of targets, exploitation of minor boundary issues, psychological pressure that stopped just short of illegal harassment. They knew exactly how far they could push without crossing legal lines. Then we got a break. A woman in Philadelphia named Gladys Turner called the tip line. She said a man named Edward Hansen was helping her with a property dispute, and his methods were making her uncomfortable. He knows things about my neighbors that he shouldn't know, she said. Private things, and he wants me to use this information to pressure them. We arranged to meet Gladys and have her wear a wire to her next meeting with Edward Hansen. I insisted on being part of the surveillance team, convinced this would be Elmer. The meeting was in a diner in downtown Philadelphia. I sat 3 booths away, watching as a man entered and sat across from Gladys. It wasn't Elmer. This man was younger, maybe 40, with different features. But his mannerisms were identical. The way he aligned his coffee cup perfectly with the edge of the table. The way he opened his notebook to precisely the middle page. Mrs. Turner, he said. His voice different from Elmer's, but with the same measured cadence. Your neighbors are vulnerable right now. The husband lost his job. They're behind on their mortgage. If you press your claim now, they'll fold. I don't want to hurt them. I just want what's fair. Fair is subjective. Property is objective. You have a legitimate claim to that strip of land. Whether you enforce it or not determines whether you're a victim or a victor. It was Elmer's philosophy, almost word for word. After the meeting, we followed Edward Hansen. He led us to a parking garage where he got into a car registered to yet another LLC. But this time, we were ready. We'd put a tracker on the car while he was in the diner. The tracker led us to a warehouse in an industrial area outside the city. We set up surveillance, and what we found was stunning. Over the course of a week, we observed 17 different people coming and going, all matching descriptions of various property consultants from our cases. It's a goddamn school, Detective Santos said. They're training people. We got a warrant and raided the warehouse at dawn. Inside, we found classrooms set up with projectors showing property maps, walls covered with charts about psychological pressure points, filing cabinets full of case studies. It was like a university for property predators. We arrested everyone present. 6 people who were in the middle of a class. Among them was Horace Hutchins, Elmer's brother. He was older than Elmer, maybe 75, with the same cold eyes. Where's your brother? I asked during interrogation. Horace smiled. Which one? I have 3 brothers, all in the family business. Elmer? Where is Elmer? Elmer is everywhere and nowhere. He's Edmund, Edward, Eugene. He's whoever he needs to be to secure property. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you'll get. Horace lawyered up immediately, as did the others. But we had enough evidence to charge them with conspiracy, fraud, and, in Roger Fitzgerald's case, manslaughter. The warehouse contained detailed records of their operations, hundreds of property disputes across 12 states, resulting in 43 deaths, mostly heart attacks and suicides, 97 forced sales, and millions in profits. The network was larger than we'd imagined. They had lawyers who created the complex paperwork, surveyors who provided questionable reports, even a few corrupt city officials who would confirm false property lines. It was a machine designed to steal homes through psychological warfare. But Elmer remained a ghost. His name appeared in documents. People referenced him in recorded conversations, but he was never physically present. Horace claimed Elmer had died in a car accident in Mexico, but no death certificate existed. Others said he'd retired to Costa Rica. One arrested consultant claimed Elmer never existed at all, that he was a composite character they'd created to take the blame if things went wrong. The trials made national news. The property wars, the media called it. Dozens of convictions, new laws passed to prevent property harassment, victim compensation funds established. It was a victory, but incomplete. I kept a photo of Elmer on my desk, the one from his driver's license. Every few months, someone would report a property consultant matching his description, but by the time we investigated, he'd be gone. The methods would be the same, though. The careful documentation, the psychological profiles, the gradual escalation of pressure. One day, 5 years after the warehouse raid, I got a package at my office. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I opened it. Inside was a property deed from 1624, the original Dutch purchase of Manhattan Island from the Lenape tribe. Attached was a note. Sergeant Mitchell, all property theft begins with a lie about boundaries. The Dutch convinced the Lenape that land could be owned, divided, sold. Every property dispute since then has been fruit of that poisoned tree. I don't steal property. I reveal its true nature. Temporary, arbitrary, violent. Your home, your land, your boundaries are all illusions maintained by force and paperwork. I simply show people how fragile those illusions are. You stopped one network, but there are others. There will always be others, because as long as people believe in property, there will be those of us who understand how to take it. Space is finite. Power is everything. E.H. Below his initials was an address, 1847 Nostrand Avenue, apartment 4B. The same building from my first case with Mrs. Mabel Hutchinson and the building people. My blood went cold. Was there a connection? Had Elmer been part of that too? I drove to Brooklyn that night. The building had been demolished 2 years ago, replaced with a modern condo complex. But the property records showed something interesting. The land had been purchased by a company called Nostrand Development Group. The CEO was listed as E. Hutchinson, not Elmer. Eleanor. I dug deeper and found that Eleanor Hutchinson was supposedly a 90-year-old woman who'd never been photographed, never appeared in public, communicated only through lawyers. Her signature on documents was a shaky scrawl that could have been forged by anyone. I realized then that Elmer had been playing a longer game than any of us understood. Every property he'd stolen, every home he'd taken, it was all building towards something bigger. He wasn't just stealing individual houses. He was accumulating land, power, control. The last time I saw him, or thought I saw him, was at Harold Kowalski's funeral. Harold had passed peacefully in his sleep at his new home in Florida. Agnes had called to let me know, and I'd driven down for the service. As the casket was being lowered, I noticed an elderly man standing at the back of the cemetery, well-dressed, watching from a distance. When our eyes met, he smiled, that same satisfied smile, and tipped his hat. By the time I pushed through the crowd to reach him, he was gone. But there was a surveyor's flag stuck in the ground where he'd been standing, marking the exact corner of Harold's burial plot. The message was clear. Even in death, boundaries mattered. Even in death, property could be disputed. I retired a year later, but I kept investigating on my own time. Property records, dispute patterns, tracking the network's evolution. They'd adapted after our raids, become more subtle, more careful. The consultants now worked entirely online, never meeting clients in person. The pressure tactics were softer but more persistent. The deaths looked more natural. Sometimes I wonder if Elmer was right about property being an illusion. Every border, every boundary, every line on a map is just an agreement we've made, a collective fiction we enforce with laws and violence. But what's the alternative? Without boundaries, without the security of knowing what's yours, chaos follows. Or maybe that's what he wanted. Chaos he could profit from. I still get postcards occasionally. Pictures of suburban streets, apartment buildings, empty lots. Never signed, but I know who sends them. Each one is a reminder that he's still out there, still playing his game, still taking people's homes one psychological break at a time. The property wars ended officially with those trials, but for people like Elmer, the war never ends. It just evolves, adapts, finds new weaknesses to exploit. And somewhere tonight, in some suburb or city, a property dispute is beginning. A fence is being questioned, a boundary is being challenged, and someone like Elmer is taking notes, making plans, preparing to destroy lives over inches of dirt. Space is finite. Power is everything. And some people will do anything to take both from you. 10 years into my retirement, I thought I was done with Elmer Hutchins and his property games. I'd moved to a small town in Maine, bought a cottage on a few acres where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. No property lines to dispute, no fences to argue over. Just peace. Then Harold and Agnes's daughter Patricia called me. "Sergeant Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you after all these years, but something's happened. My mother, she's in trouble." Agnes was now 78, living alone since Harold's death. She'd moved back to New York to a senior living community in Westchester. It was supposed to be safe, secure, free from the kind of property disputes that had destroyed Harold's health. But Patricia explained that her mother was being pressured to sell her unit to another resident, a man named Ernest Hamilton. "He says my mother's unit actually extends into his space, that the original building plans were wrong. He has all these documents, surveys, expert opinions. Mom's terrified. She says it's happening again, just like with that horrible Elmer man." I should have said no. I should have recommended a lawyer, a police officer who wasn't retired, anyone but me. But I heard the fear in Patricia's voice, the same fear I'd heard in Harold's voice all those years ago. I drove to New York the next day. The senior living community was called Sunset Gardens, one of those places that looked like a cross between a hotel and a hospital. Agnes was in the memory care wing now, early stage dementia, but still lucid most of the time. "Officer Mitchell," she said when she saw me, her face lighting up with recognition. "Have you come about Elmer? He's here, you know. He's calling himself Ernest now, but I know it's him." Patricia touched her mother's hand gently. "Mom, that's not possible. Elmer would be very old by now if he's even still alive." But Agnes was insistent. "It's the same smile. The same way of measuring everything with his eyes. The same voice talking about boundaries and power." I met Ernest Hamilton that afternoon. He was in his 60s, tall and thin, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. Nothing like Elmer physically, but when he aligned his coffee cup perfectly with the edge of the table in the common room, when he opened his notebook to exactly the center page, I felt a chill. "You must be the famous Sergeant Mitchell," he said, and his voice was different from Elmer's but had the same measured cadence. "Agnes told me all about you, how you tried to help during that unfortunate situation with her late husband." What exactly is your claim against Mrs. Kowalski's unit? He pulled out a folder, movements precise and deliberate. It's quite simple. When this building was converted to senior living 20 years ago, there was an error in the unit divisions. My unit, 4B, should actually extend 18 inches into what's currently designated as part of 4A. Agnes's unit, 4B. The same apartment number as Mrs. Mabel Hutchinson's apartment where I'd found the bodies in the walls. The same as the reference in Elmer's final note to me. It couldn't be coincidence. That's a very specific claim, I said. Do you have proof? Oh, yes. He spread out documents on the table. Original building plans, conversion permits, surveys. All of them looked authentic, but I'd learned not to trust documents in property disputes. Why does 18 inches matter so much to you? Ernest smiled, and it was eerily familiar. It's not about the space, Sergeant. It's about the truth, about correct boundaries, about ensuring everyone has exactly what they're entitled to. No more, no less. The exact philosophy Elmer had spouted, just rephrased. I spent the next week investigating Ernest Hamilton. On paper, he was perfect. Retired insurance adjuster, moved to Sunset Gardens 2 years ago, no criminal record. But digging deeper, I found gaps. No employment history before 2010. No family. No social media presence. His previous address led to an apartment that had burned down in a fire, destroying all records. Meanwhile, Agnes was deteriorating. The stress of the property dispute was accelerating her dementia. She'd have clear days where she'd beg me to stop Ernest, then confused days where she'd think Harold was still alive and coming to save her. Patricia was at her wit's end. The facility says it's a civil matter. Ernest hasn't done anything illegal, but he measures her doorway every morning at exactly 7 a.m. He's installed cameras pointing at her unit. He leaves documents under her door showing how much space she's stealing from him. Classic Elmer tactics, just adapted for a senior living facility. I decided to confront Ernest directly. I found him in his unit, 4B, which was disturbingly familiar. The obsessive organization, the surveying equipment in the corner, the walls covered with property maps and building plans. But what stopped me cold was a photo on his desk. A group of men, all different ages, but all with the same sharp features, the same cold eyes. One of them was definitely Elmer. Family photo? I asked. In a way. We're all brothers in the same cause, the pursuit of proper boundaries. You're one of Elmer's brothers. Horace mentioned 3 brothers. Ernest's smile widened. Elmer, Horace, Eugene, and Ernest. Our parents had a fondness for E names, and we all inherited their fondness for property law. Where's Elmer? Who can say? We don't keep in close touch. Different cities, different projects, but we share the same methods, the same philosophy. The same sick need to torture people over imaginary boundaries. Imaginary? Ernest stood, walked to his window that looked out at Agnes's unit. Every boundary is imaginary until it's enforced. Every property line is just an agreement until someone disagrees. We simply reveal the fragility of these agreements and profit from the chaos. Everyone profits from something. We profit from understanding space better than others. I left his unit knowing I couldn't prove he was connected to Elmer, couldn't prove the documents were forged, couldn't stop him legally. But I also knew I couldn't let him destroy Agnes the way Elmer had destroyed Harold. That night I broke into Ernest's unit while he was at dinner. I'm not proud of it, but I needed evidence. What I found in a locked filing cabinet changed everything. It wasn't just documents about Agnes's unit. Ernest had files on every resident in Sunset Gardens. Medical records, financial statements, family information. And more disturbing, he had a schedule. A timeline showing when each resident would be targeted based on their health, financial status, and family support. Agnes was just the beginning. But the most shocking discovery was a letter from Elmer, dated just a month ago. Ernest, the Gardens project proceeds as planned. Focus on the vulnerable ones first. The Kowalski woman is perfect. History of property trauma, developing dementia, daughter too busy to visit regularly. Once you've secured her unit, move to the others I've marked. Remember, patience is everything. Let the pressure build naturally. Let them break themselves. The network is expanding. Eugene has secured 3 buildings in Chicago. Horace is working on a development in Miami. Soon we'll have enough properties to move to Phase 2. Space is finite. Power is everything. Elmer. Phase 2. There was something bigger happening here. I photographed everything, but I knew stolen evidence wouldn't hold up in court. I needed another way. That's when I remembered something Agnes had said on one of her clear days. He's afraid of something. I can see it when anyone mentions inspections or building codes. The next morning, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in building inspections. Sure enough, Sunset Gardens had several code violations that had been covered up or ignored. Nothing major, but enough to require a full inspection. When the inspectors arrived, Ernest panicked. He tried to block them from entering his unit, claiming they needed a warrant. But this was a routine safety inspection, and the facility had the right to enter. What they found in Ernest's unit wasn't just surveying equipment. He'd been slowly, methodically altering the building itself, moving walls inch by inch, adjusting door frames, changing the physical boundaries of units. The work was so gradual, so careful, that no one had noticed. But over 2 years, he'd actually shifted the layout of the entire floor by several feet. "This is illegal construction," the inspector said. "This compromises the structural integrity of the building." Ernest was arrested for building code violations, illegal construction, and when they found the stolen medical records, HIPAA violations. It wasn't as satisfying as getting him for the psychological torture he'd inflicted, but it was enough to stop him. During the arrest, Ernest looked at me with that familiar smile. "You think you've won? This building is just one node in a network. We have hundreds of properties, thousands of units. Every retirement home, every apartment complex, every place where people are vulnerable and boundaries can be questioned. We'll stop you, all of you. No, you won't. Because we're not criminals, we're inevitability. As long as people need homes, as long as space has value, we'll exist. We're the logical conclusion of property ownership, those who understand the system well enough to exploit it." As they led him away, he called out one last thing. "Check your cottage in Maine, Sergeant. Check the eastern boundary. You might be surprised what you find." I didn't want to give him the satisfaction, but I couldn't help myself. When I got home to Maine, I hired a surveyor to check my property lines. The eastern boundary, the one I'd never worried about because it bordered conservation land, was off by 3 feet. Had always been off, according to old records the surveyor found. 3 feet of my land was technically public property. It didn't matter. The Conservation Trust had no interest in 3 feet of forest. But Ernest, or Elmer, or whoever had sent him, wanted me to know they could reach me anywhere. That property was never truly secure. The trial of Ernest Hutchins made small news in local papers. He was sentenced to 5 years for the building code violations and illegal construction. His brothers were never found. The network, if it existed as Ernest described, stayed hidden. Agnes Kowalski spent her last years peacefully in Sunset Gardens, the property dispute forgotten as her dementia progressed. She died believing Harold was still alive, waiting for her in their old house on Parsons Boulevard. Patricia thanked me for helping, but I could see in her eyes the same fear that had lived in her father's. The knowledge that home, safety, boundaries were all more fragile than we wanted to believe. I still live in my cottage in Maine, 3 feet smaller than I thought it was. Every morning I check the boundaries, look for surveyors' flags, watch for strangers with measuring equipment. It's paranoia, maybe, but earned paranoia. Sometimes I dream about walls moving, about houses shifting in the night, about property lines creeping like living things. In those dreams, Elmer Hutchins stands with his surveying equipment, measuring everything, dividing the world into smaller and smaller pieces until there's nothing left but lines on maps and the spaces between them where people used to live. The last postcard came a year ago. A photo of my cottage, taken from the eastern boundary, from that 3 feet of land that was never mine. On the back, in handwriting, I recognized, "Every boundary you believe in is a lie someone told you. Every wall that makes you feel safe is just delayed disappointment. We don't create property disputes. We reveal them. They were always there, waiting in the surveys and deeds and measurements, waiting for someone with the vision to see them." You stopped Ernest, but Eugene continues. Horace rebuilds. And I am become property itself, destroyer of homes. Thank you for the education, Sergeant. Your fear taught us to be more careful. Your investigations showed us our weaknesses. We are better now because of you. Space remains finite. Power remains everything. And somewhere, someone is measuring their boundaries, not knowing they've already lost. E.H. I wanted to track him down, to finish what I'd started all those years ago on Parsons Boulevard, but I was tired, old, and I knew the truth he'd been telling all along. The system that created property also created people like him. They were inseparable, two sides of the same deed. So I stayed in my cottage, 3 feet smaller, but still mine. I kept my boundaries clear, my documents ready, my walls solid. Because that's all any of us can do. Hold our ground, guard our space, and hope the measurers and surveyors pass us by. But late at night, when the wind blows through the trees on that disputed eastern boundary, I swear I can hear measuring tapes extending, levels finding true, and somewhere in the darkness, Elmer Hutchins smiling as another boundary shifts. Another home becomes uncertain. Another person discovers that everything they thought was theirs was always up for debate. Space is finite. Power is everything. And the property wars never really end.